The year is 2100 and you are the last real person on Earth. There are no more people or families or places with traditions and identities, only these overboiling cityscapes filled with mindless consumers. All allegiance belongs exclusively to the corporate globalist hegemony that has long since devoured and exploited anything it can get its hands on. Whether in abject solitude or even out in the open as you trudge through the filth and mire, you faintly yearn for a time where the faces through which you pass were something more discernible than the unsexed, ghastly amalgamations that now float by. You wish there was something to be done, but there is no one left to do anything about it, and you cannot escape. Even if you desire to commit such blasphemy as having a child, even if you were so unconventional as to retain attraction to the opposite sex, the likelihood of that happening is astronomically low due to the chemicals in the food and the water which have long made everyone impotent. Something has gone terribly wrong, but you are completely alone in noticing. No one else will complain in 2100. No one will want anything more than an identity in consumption, gratification in endless and free vice, all bereft of any attachment or responsibility. You can be anything you want, so long as you are not a threat. Anything but what God has made you, especially if you're a man. And whether in your pod or the occasional venture outside, that faint sense of yearning for a different past waxes with each compulsory step you take. Soon, you will be just like the rest, devoid of all will or identity or virtue. But just before the irresistible euphoria of conformity washes over you, you think for yourself for the last time. If only we had listened to the warnings. And that's exactly what I'm here to do, because in case you want to live in a world like that, you'd better listen up. I've seen the future, and for the Western world, it's not looking too bright. But it isn't the future just yet. My name is James Anderson White, and I'm basically the John Connor of the anti-global homo rebellion, and I've come back to tell you that it doesn't have to be this way. That is, if only we have the spine to fight back. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at war. Not overseas, not against China or Russia, but right here on our own soil. And while certain malicious actors of our corrupt elite class knowingly participate in the degradation of our society, most people are completely unaware that they participate too. The average person is simply a pawn on a board that doesn't exist purely in the physical realm. This battlefield lies predominantly in the spiritual world. It is so much bigger than politics or personal preferences or any one generation. Everything is on the line. Will we emerge from this downward spiral and reinstitute the values and customs that once defined the West? Or will we continue down this path of destruction until we are no more? That's what this is about. It's a battle between who we are and the people trying to erase who we are. We used to rule and dictate not with overbearing regulations, but with a collective moral framework predicated by a near universal adherence to God's word. We used to aspire to build families, to improve our cities, to steward our land. We used to have an identity rooted in faith, family, and country, and we used to be led by faithful, God-fearing men. Not perfect, but noble men nonetheless. But now our adversaries want to burn that all to the ground. They hate God, they hate our country, and they want to see every last one of us devolve into mindless, consumeristic blobs who never think of anything other than what product to buy next or what orifice to use for gratification. They want to get rid of families and nations, and they want to do so by destroying the men destined to lead and protect their family and nation. They seek to kill, steal, and destroy because they serve forces who revile God and all that He has made. And ever since we started trying to remove God from our societies, ever since we started playing pretend like we could somehow have morality under secularism, these long dormant forces reemerged. Ancient principalities of dominion, transformation, destruction, and countless other abominations have clamored to assume the throne that would otherwise be reserved for God alone had man's hubris not intervened. You think I exaggerate? You think this is not the case? This is already happening in all of our major cities, and it will continue to infect the rest of our civilization if it isn't stopped once and for all. That's because it's driven by something more than what we can comprehend in the physical world. If you chalk all this up to political differences or greed or mental illness or whatever you can think of that denies the spiritual nature, how do you explain the mass coordination of these malicious efforts undertaken by wildly incompetent people? Do you think it's mere happenstance that the people in our government, our news, our entertainment, and our medical system, who are all idiots, just so happen to be in perfect lockstep with each other to push the same message? doesn't make any sense. And how do you explain how everything we're seeing now is patterned exactly after what occurred in the ancient world prior to the coming of Christ and the Christianization of the Western world? They're not driven by anything earthly. They are driven by an insatiable hatred for God. This civilization, especially the United States of America, which has long stood as a stronghold for Christianity, is in their way. In waging war on God, they need to topple our nation. And to destroy our nation, they need to destroy our families. And to destroy our families, they need to destroy men. Men are under attack on all fronts. As much as women are integral to the health of society, the responsibility of how it runs falls squarely upon the shoulders of men. We have a natural, God-given mantle of leadership, but these attacks on manhood have rendered most of us ineffective in that role. The only reason those attacks were effective in the first place is because men intentionally gave up that mantle of leadership. Men decided to sit back in order to let the oppressive patriarchy be replaced with a blood-sucking, life-draining matriarchy where everyone is equally fat, gay, and miserable. And while there only may be a few of us left to resist this, there is still time to shore up our defenses, to restructure our minds, and assert ourselves into becoming the leaders this world so desperately needs. Like it or not, this is our burden. This is our responsibility. There is still time to uproot the deep-seated lies that encourage our own self-destruction, to tear down the idols and burn the demonic footholds in our culture, and to reframe our minds and reorient our hearts towards the things of God. There is still time to fight, because the enemy we face isn't going to stop because of our principles or our niceness or our well-supported, thoroughly articulated arguments. They are hell-bent on destroying you, your family, and this nation, and they are evil. There's no compromising with evil. They play for keeps, so I think it's high time we stop playing for anything less. They desire total dominion, and they won't stop at the privacy of one's own bedroom. They want it all out in the open for everyone to see. And if you take a look at the history, at the course of the progressive cause, you'll realize that this was always the goal. They just don't hide it anymore. Will you dare to see the prevalent narrative for what it is? If any concession or shortcoming of total victory isn't enough for them, it shouldn't be enough for us. We can no longer just selectively treat the symptoms or speak vain platitudes without putting it all on the line. We have to get at the root and incinerate the weed of anti-Christian progressivism, destroying our country once and for all. So join me as we take a deep dive into the all-out war on everything good, godly, and natural centered in the eradication of men. I know it's a long one, but hey, I promise it'll be worth it, so please watch all the way through, at the very least to understand my full argument. This operation isn't going to be easy, but it's do or die at this point. So boys, strap on your boots, break out your ice picks, and let's climb back up the slippery slope in the hopes that, by God's grace, we might escape this hellish no man's land we found ourselves in. If you're familiar with basic behavioral psychology, you're probably familiar with the concept of fight or flight. It's a name for the acute stress response present in both wild nature and humanity, descriptive of the main two instinctual reactions to a perceived threat. When you are threatened, you are biologically compelled to either flee from the stimulus or eliminate it based on the estimated success of either option. But what if that threat is perceived as pervasive, as totally inescapable? If the option for flight seems rendered a statistical impossibility, the only choice left is violent retaliation. But what if you perceived a threat as pervasive, saw no other option but to fight it, but it turned out that your perception was flawed? You would be fighting everything around you under the pretense of self-defense, but your initial perception, your entire worldview, it's inaccurate. Needless to say, you would be a danger to everything around you. And that's exactly the case with the peddlers of the transgenocide narrative.
And this narrative is not only dangerous to our mental health, but also our physical safety.
Ever since the normalization of transgenderism in the United States, there's been a growing narrative that these poor trans people are hated for who they are innately and that they're under attack from everyone.
More than any other group of people.
And that crippling social stigma they experience leads to violence against them. But this could not be further from the truth. If you've had any experience whatsoever with the left, you know that the way they lie, and they lie a lot, it's never 2 or 3 shades off from the truth. They're hardly ever white lies or half-truths. It's usually the exact inverse of the truth. In reality, they hate the truth so vehemently that they want to be as far from it as possible. It's true that there's a great deal of violence surrounding these people who call themselves transgender, and that violence is increasing. But this violence, it's not inflicted upon them by other people. They are the perpetrators themselves. It happened in Nashville when a woman pretending to be a man directly targeted a Christian school and murdered 3 adults and 3 children.
There's gunshots up at the church! Oh God, what? Read this, our teacher did.
And those are only some of the more recent cases among the growing number of shootings, assaults, and countless calls for violence online.
I would challenge anyone just to get to know trans people.
The 25-year-old, who identifies as a woman, told detectives she heard voices saying she'd be mutilated if she didn't torch the church.
We are a vibrant, diverse community, as diverse as anyone else.
If you have trouble accepting that, then maybe instead you can accept my size 13 steel toe on your trachea.
You cut that out now, or you'll go home in an ambulance.
This is a growing phenomenon, and it shows no signs of stopping. These people, they don't see the world as it is. That much is obvious. But their delusion, it extends beyond wanting to change their own biology. The way they see the world justifies violence towards you, towards your family, and towards everyone who doesn't bend the knee and participate in their charade. Your existence as a normal person is the existential threat they face, and they cannot coexist with you. There is no in-between, no compromises. Everything about our society will unravel if we don't dig in our heels and say that men are men and women are women, and it doesn't matter what anyone wants to think otherwise, we're not putting up with it. Our future, especially the future our children will inherit, is at stake. This ideology is inherently destructive, and if we don't begin to understand the core of the issue, if we don't have the guts to reach down into the dirt and pull it up at the root, they will do the same to us first. There is hope, but it is an urgent hope. Only through proclaiming and standing on the truth, and hoping that these people who were so greatly deceived might be reconciled with that truth which we champion, we might just make it out of this alive. But only if we accept nothing short of absolute truth. Before we get into this, I want to mention quickly that I think so-called transgender people are deserving of incredible sympathy. They are deeply deceived and sinful individuals, and I feel genuine sorrow for the anguish they feel inside. Thankfully, they are not beyond salvation, and the increasing number of detransitioners proves that people can turn around from this lifestyle. But their deception does not mean that they are without responsibility for their actions, particularly those who deceive others, especially children. I do not hate these people, but I hate the ideas they push and what those ideas are doing to this country. I hope that these people can come to realize how self-destructive their lifestyle is to their own lives and to our society, but at the same time, I feel it urgently necessary that their violence against God, themselves, and in many cases other people should be acknowledged without mincing words and the deception obliterated for good. You see, the whole reason we got into this mess in the first place is because our country was duped into tolerating outright lies. They may have sounded harmless at first. They may have been masterfully tooled to take advantage of our weaknesses, but we are seeing firsthand how destructive they are right now. The first lie comes in the form of what transgenderism is, or should I say transvestism, because the other words that we use to describe this issue are misnomers in the first place. And if we can't even correctly identify and label what it is we're talking about, we will never be able to effectively address it. One of the most potent tools for normalizing foreign and unnatural ideas is through changing language. These terms get wrapped in euphemisms that disguise what they actually are. Transgender is inaccurate because the whole concept of gender being an amorphous entity separate from biological sex is inaccurate. Okay, so we'll call them transsexuals, but that's not accurate either because they're not actually changing their sex. This isn't about who they are on the inside like they would like you to believe. It's a grotesque attempt at warping an inward reality that only tangibly manifests itself in an outward veneer. They can't change their sex. They can only change the outward perception of their sex. Or at least they can try. But wouldn't you know it, men don't make very pretty women, and women don't make all that handsome of men. And if you think there are exceptions to these rules, you've probably only seen these people lacking any referent to what they're actually trying to look like. Because when you take away the internet, it's not all that flattering. The word which was formerly used to describe this phenomenon was transvestite. Trans being the Latin prefix for across, the antonym of cis meaning near, coupled with vestis, the Latin word for clothing. It literally means cross-dress. They're not changing who they are on the inside. They're just putting on different clothes, or in the worst case, horrifically augmenting their body. And the word that we used to use for those people was really messed up in the head and desperately in need of help. But nowadays we use these sciencey sounding buzzwords to sound more palatable. And it's been remarkably effective. But despite its normalization in recent years, this isn't exactly a new thing. If we observe the history, these practices have actually been around much longer than you may think. In the ancient world, decadent pagan societies saw their fair share of transvestism. Whether you worship Sol Invictus like the infamous femboy Roman Emperor Elagabalus, or you serve the whore goddess Ashtoreth in the Middle East, blurring the lines between male and female were not only present in those societies, but often part of their cultic ceremonies. Ashtoreth and her variants Ishtar, Eanna, Venus, or Aphrodite were worshipped in many places in the ancient world, but despite being a prostitute goddess who was said to be womanlike in the day, she became a masculine god of war and wrath at night. Ancient Sumerian poems reveal that she was said to have the power to turn women into men and men into women. Even her own priesthood, which was comprised of men, but they cross-dressed and even castrated themselves as a form of worship. But with the coming of Christ and the universal spread of Christianity in the ancient world, these pagan cults and their sex rituals disappeared into the deep recesses of the earth. For over a millennium, the West operated off a Christian moral framework. That doesn't mean that everyone was righteous and that men did not go astray, but sexual deviancy on this scale was largely absent from society. Until we get to the rapid secularization of Europe in the early 20th century. Like I said, these things aren't particularly new in the ancient world or the modern one. They've only become normalized in the last decade, and their reappearance occurred almost 100 years ago at the Institute for Sexual Research in Weimar, Germany, ran by a pervert named Magnus Hirschfeld. Sexual deviancy had become much more common during this time as Europe's culture devolved into this avant-garde nonsense, more on that in this video. And many of these increasingly secular and industrialized European cities had developed an underbelly of debauchery. Hirschfeld, himself with a particular likening to much younger boys, opened an institute to study all the ways you could pervert God's design, including performing the first attempts to surgically give a man a fake vagina and cut off the breasts of a woman. Despite the countless suicides occurring both from Hirschfeld's lovers and his patients, he was hailed as the foremost expert on these topics and brought to the US by a man named Harry Benjamin, who was a student at the Institute for Sexual Research and the inventor of the term transsexual. Hirschfeld toured the US speaking about his research, and Benjamin created a team to put that research into practice here in the US, as well as the organization that would come to be known as WPATH. More on that later. One of the psychologists on that research team was none other than the infamous John Money. Now, if you don't know John Money, he's the guy that popularized Hirschfeld and Benjamin's research in the US and began conducting research of his own.
Suffice it to say, he was an extremely influential man, and anybody who propagates left-wing gender theory today is repeating at least some of the ideas of John Money, whether they know it or not, and most of them do not know it. That fact, I think, ought to trouble gender theory proponents because John Money was, among other things, a fraud and an abuser and a pedophile.
He's also responsible for taking the term gender, a word which previously was only used in grammar, and applied it to people, advocating that gender was separate from sex and that gender roles, a concept he also invented, were socially constructed and not biological. This, of course, proved not to be the case when he prescribed the medical transitioning of a young boy named Bruce Reimer in the 1960s, after Bruce's botched circumcision left him nearly castrated. Money informed the parents of Bruce that he ought to be raised as Brenda, but despite his insistence that gender was socially constructed, Bruce still behaved like a boy and lived a very unhappy life being treated like a girl. On top of this, Money tried to reinforce this unnatural intervention by forcing Bruce and his twin brother Brian into imitating sexual positions with each other, all while he verbally abused them and took photos. These were young children, by the way. Bruce was eventually told the truth about what happened. He transitioned back into being a man and changed his name to David, but the damage was already done. Both he and his brother ended up committing suicide in their late 30s because of the deep childhood trauma that lingered from Money's therapies. And while these therapies were taking place, Money spent decades making a career talking about what a success the Bruce to Brenda transition had been. This guy is where we get modern gender ideology from, and anyone who parrots these ideas that gender is a social construct, or that it's possible for someone to be born in the wrong body or incorrectly assigned at birth or raised as a different gender, they're all repeating what this sick bastard peddled so he could take photos of twin boys, one of them mutilated, lying on top of each other naked. And it hardly mattered how much of a failure those experiments were, because once you open Pandora's box, once you start down the slippery slope, there is no going back. Around the same time that these experiments were taking place, the US was undergoing the sexual revolution, which began removing any and all stigma or societal precedent around what sex or identity should be. But while the sexual revolution propelled us further into confusion and eroded the foundations of, a sane and logical understanding of these issues, gender theory still wasn't accepted into the mainstream until around the last 10 years. Bruce Jenner coming out and calling himself Caitlyn was immensely influential in normalizing the false idea of transgenderism in the mainstream. No longer were these obscure cases. This was the guy that every adult grew up seeing on the Wheaties box. A guy who was a symbol of masculinity and athleticism, but now he's calling himself a woman? Since the World Health Organization no longer classifies the phenomenon as a mental illness, except when it's convenient to classify it that way so that taxpayer dollars end up paying for the surgeries, we've seen a huge spike in these ideas and their participants. These ideas have become so popular to the point where they're grossly overrepresented in mainstream media. And if all your information came from the mainstream, I guarantee you would think the number much higher than the 0.5 to 0.6% of Americans that actually identify as transgender. And the consequences of this normalization through mainstream outlets like social media can be readily observed in the rate of identification among young generations, which far outpaces that of older generations. This is particularly devastating for young women who, despite male to female transitions getting all the attention, are actually more susceptible to taking on a transgender identity, particularly through social coercion. The main cause for male to female transitions is a little bit different, but we'll get into that later. Even though it's become widely accepted to practice some form of transvestism, we only see a massive surge in the generations who partially or completely grew up on the internet. If this was about people being their true selves, you think we would see boomers or Gen Xers coming out at a rate at least similar to that of younger people, but that's not at all the case. This, of course, is because the rapid dissemination of influence that occurs across modern high-speed internet expedites decay. During the COVID lockdowns alone, when everyone was at home and on the internet all day, there was a massive spike in young people identifying as whatever model of LGTV you can think of. It's no question that this issue is so much more prevalent now than it was prior to lockdowns. This kind of stuff occurs within young people pretty much exclusively under the introduction of these ideas from someone else. Are there girls who go through a tomboy phase, or boys who maybe play with dolls over trucks for a few months? Yeah, sure. But those behaviors, they all go away unless they're entertained by a delusional parent, usually a mother who herself is mentally ill, or the child is introduced to these ideas by a coercive and abusive adult in a doctor's office, or most often, online. And if you think social media is bad for introducing young people to these ideas, that pales in comparison to the impact of pornography, which, by the way, is the whole reason we have high-speed internet in the first place. Just look at the recent case of Chris Tyson, one of the former stars of the Mr. Beast crew, the largest independent YouTube channel on the planet. I already spoke about this case in another video, but to summarize, this guy decides out of the blue that he's going to pretend to be a woman, leaving his wife without a husband and his young son without a masculine role model. And according to his Twitter, he was into some really weird pornography, including stuff involving depictions of children, which is yet another disturbing wrinkle we'll have the displeasure of discussing in just a moment. Once that stuff gets in your head, once you create that connection between what you see, what you think, and what is carnally gratifying, it can start to rewire your brain. And that's part of what's so fundamentally misunderstood about this issue. It's not about who they are on the inside. It's not even accurate to medicalize it and relegate it to just being a mental disorder. It's a sexual fetish. In most cases, for men at least, transvestism isn't because they feel like they need to become a woman because that's who they are on the inside, but because they get off on the idea of being a woman. For women who become men, it's usually a depression or social anxiety which manifests into them thinking they're a boy because they're coerced by other people to think that, because that's what's trendy to do on TikTok nowadays. Unlike male-female, which is a fetish, the other way around occurs, as I said, because of anxiety and depression, but it's not really accurate to say that they think that they're a boy or even that they want to become a boy the same way that trans males want to become a woman. The women who become trans have been convinced by other women that there's this inescapable male gaze, that because they are women, they will always be under constant sexualization from all men and all women because of like the patriarchy and internalized misogyny or whatever. Because of this, they want to destroy every semblance of womanhood in themselves, which is why they aren't actually trying to become men. They're just trying to become as unfeminine as possible, so they end up being very ugly and unappealing in the end. This kind of mental turmoil is what would drive someone like the Nashville shooter to want to take out their rage on a society that they feel has done this to them. But for men trying to become women, it's a different story. For men, it's almost always a case of either homosexuality or most commonly what's called autogynephilia. Coined by psychologist Ray Blanchard, the term comes from the Greek auto, meaning self, gyne, meaning woman, and philia, meaning love. So literally loving oneself as a woman. These men are usually straight, but somehow they become attracted to the idea of themselves as a woman. But in either case, whether they're gay or an autogynephile, it's a man taking on the role of a woman on some level for sexual gratification. Going back to the aforementioned Bruce Jenner, all of his ex-wives divorced him over having this fetish, and each have written something to the effect of how he fantasized about being a woman and was even caught wearing women's clothing. And this kind of sequence is exactly what you'll find to have occurred with non-gay men who transition. It starts as a kink, a mistargeting of their erotic desire from that of another woman, which morphs into this idea of themselves as a woman until it grows so vicious that they must attempt to become a woman. When a man watches porn and touches himself, he's effectively having sex with himself. So it makes sense that in some cases he may begin to associate part of himself with the receiving end that he sees on screen. However, that's only the impetus. That's only the beginning of opening up your mind and body to being tampered with. But of course, trannies deny this vehemently, and they slandered Ray Blanchard for describing this phenomenon. It's not about who they are, it's just a weird sexual fetish that eventually takes over their lifestyle. It becomes such a strong part of their identity that they have to conform the rest of their identity around it, which makes so much more sense than this whole notion that gender is relative and on a spectrum. If that were the case, why do men appropriate a specific and well-understood caricature of womanhood? If it were subjective, why do they need to change anything about their outward appearance? It's because they're perverts, and they have to reconcile that with other parts of their life. I hate to break it to all the women's sports advocates out there, but men don't transition to get an edge in women's sports. They insist on still participating in sports as a woman because it's a charade, and they don't want to forfeit their identity as an athlete because of their perceived identity as a woman, and also because maybe they hate women for having what they never will. What begins as an inward perversion must manifest outwardly if it is allowed to persist. Remember William Thomas? His social media activity on his secondary private Instagram page, as well as the activity of his partner, who's also a man pretending to be a woman, shows how depraved these people are. William's partner's page has a lot more to offer because it's public, and his posts, plus ones William has liked or been featured in, include, but are not limited to, posts specifically depicting autogynephilia, including drawn pornography, posts showing William among other ambiguous characters supposedly in a polyamorous relationship with one another, posts depicting BDSM and the aftermath in partaking in violent intimate activities, and even posts from before and after William's operation castrating himself, and a photo of his partner holding an all but labeled mystery organ in a ball jar. Now, do you want to tell me that he did this just because he wasn't a great swimmer as a man and thought he could grift as a woman for a trophy? Or do you want to wake up and realize that it's because him and all the people like him are deeply depraved, and their depravity is destroying their lives and destroying the lives around them? This is how sin corrupts. It can't stay hidden, it must consume entirely. Because the spirit behind transgenderism is the spirit of complete and total destruction. We already touched on Ashtoreth and her influence in the ancient world and the androgynous rituals performed by her male priestesses, but the spirit which always comes after Ashtoreth is Moloch, the destroyer. The way these forces work is in a specific sequence and always compounding in effect. And after transformation occurs away from the way that God created things to be, there will always come annihilation. In Mark 5, Jesus confronts a demon named Legion, who, if you recall, causes the man they possess to cut himself, and the pigs they were cast into were made to kill themselves. And I don't think it's exactly coincidence that shortly after Chris Tyson came out as trans, he quoted this demon word for word.
It is to me. I am Mr. Beast. We are like a legion. We are one. We are many.
And I also don't think it's a coincidence that the way that people describe the process by which a man becomes a transvestite is the development of an internal alternate personality that takes over the host mind. This internal personality is his idea of himself as a woman, which festers under the surface until he gives it a name, and it continues to divulge in sin and continues to feed that internal personality until it takes over his mind entirely. These spirits want nothing less than the destruction of the people who allow them to meddle with their minds. And when it comes to destruction and all-consuming sin, it's no wonder that internet pornography is at the start of all of this. Like any sin, and especially with particularly addictive ones, the satanic temptation is never satisfied. You may get the thrill the first time, but the returns are always diminishing, so you have to seek out even more depraved and even more debauched porn to get your fix. Couple this insatiable hunger with a finely tuned online algorithm that constantly feeds you exactly what will coax you along just a little bit more, and you have a life-destroying positive feedback loop. If you look into the types of porn that a lot of these guys admit to looking at, it explains everything. The Michael Knowles Show did a segment on this where the guest basically explained that not only is pornography involving transvestism common, but there are whole subcategories which involve, encourage, and coerce people into it. There are whole subcategories where the people on screen are forced to wear women's clothing, take hormones, or even undergo reassignment surgeries. Even worse, there are videos, both on porn sites but even out in the open on YouTube, which use hypnosis and humiliation rituals to brainwash the viewer into thinking they should become a woman. And worse still, there are yet more examples of this material involving children. It's no wonder that so many drag performers and trannies end up being pedophiles. They see it in the porn, but one day it's not enough to just watch it. They have to act it out for real. And these are far from isolated cases. There are people who lurk online on Reddit or Twitter, or they just get a job as a public school teacher, and they try to intervene in the lives of these young kids, often in return for lewd photos or roleplay. There are even people who ship hormones into other states where they're completely illegal. They're using the internet to remotely brainwash and castrate children. And if anyone else was doing this, we'd call them the terrorists they are. Go ahead and put a millstone around their neck and be done with them. But that's not going to happen because our own government endorses this. Remember WPATH, the organization I mentioned earlier that was started by Harry Benjamin? They set the protocols for medically transitioning children. And they cite in their own standards of care an online forum which contains written child pornography centered around chemically castrating and abusing children. Does that sound familiar? Maybe that sounds exactly like John Money, who we discussed earlier. You think that was a one-off case? You think he was just some sicko and the rest of them are just fine? This website that the WPATH has worked with for over a decade contains information about how to castrate yourself, and it also contains thousands of forum entries tagged with the word minor. This isn't about who they really are on the inside. This can't be solved by just letting them do their own thing. These people are sick in the head, and they are the ones seeking to destroy, not the other way around. Which of course is immensely contrary to the mainstream narrative. According to the peddlers of the whole trans genocide story, it's shame and social stigma that lead to violence and harm against them, even self-harm. And to a certain extent, they're right. These people do feel deep and oppressive shame. There's a certain cultural abrasion surrounding the issue because there are still plenty of people who find it seriously uncomfortable and unnatural. Just don't expect to find those people among your average Republicans, but I digress. And there's a reason this social shame exists. There has always been a healthy amount of social stigma necessary to keep deviancy in check. But these people hate being held to any sort of standard, social or otherwise. They want all their sexual perversions to be out in the open and widely accepted, and this is why they wage war. Your nonconformity to their charade is perceived as an existential threat to their existence. They believe your non-participation is the source of the shame they feel. And if they can get rid of you and everyone else who doesn't agree with them, the shame will all magically go away. and they can live their lives in their delusions happily ever after. There is no live and let live with these people. There is no coexisting when they can't even coexist within themselves because their ideology is so contradictory. But that's the thing. While they may in fact face social shame, that's still not the source of the shame. The external shame is only the reinforcement. The shame that drives them to do such heinous things to themselves and to other people, it comes from within. Everyone who falls into the trans lifestyle becomes a perpetual rebel against immovable nature. They try to suppress one of the most basic truths about identity, the innate natures of men and women respectively. As Paul describes it in Romans 1, God's attributes, including the way in which he ordered the world, are clearly seen and understood, even by the unbeliever. And if they give in to vile passions, they're going against what's natural. They will never feel right because they will never be right if they continue to rebel against nature and suppress the truth. The divide between male and female that they're trying to cross, even though it's minimized in our pathetically androgynous society, it's insurmountable. If you take on the trans lifestyle and expect everyone to play along, you may change your clothes or your hair or take hormones or even cut parts of your body away and stick them somewhere else. But you will never change the size and shape of your skull, or the shape of the bones in your face, or the thickness of your skin, or the width of your shoulders, or the location of your body's fat stores, or whether or not you naturally lactate, or your lung capacity, or the size of your heart, or the shape of your pelvis, or the shape of your hands, or your capacity to lift weights, or your average basal metabolic rate, or your height, or the sensitivity of your nervous system, or the sensitivity of your emotions, or the average number of white blood cells in your bloodstream, or your entire endocrine system, or your entire skeletal system, or the length between your anus and your genitals, or even the genitals which you actually possess, because a flap of skin from another part of your body that requires daily maintenance so that your body doesn't heal it like the wound it correctly identifies it to be really doesn't count. And on and on and on until you get down to the chromosomes in every single somatic cell in your body which say that you are male or you are female, which you will never be able to change. And you know it. They all know it. So they can either decide to begin to reconcile with the truth, or they will be left with no other option than to keep coping. And how else do you cope against your very nature than denying the one who made that nature in the first place? To try the impossible task of reconciling transgender ideology with reality, you are required to replace God. That's why their ideology is effectively the exact antithesis of Christianity. The Bible says that in Christ we're made a new creation, that we die to ourselves and are born again. And what do they have? They have dead names and new false identities instead. God says that he has made man in his image. Male and female, he created them. So they decide to become creators themselves, remaking the world as they see fit. But as Tolkien so aptly described, the forces of evil cannot create anything new. They can only corrupt and ruin. Christ says that you are redeemed by his love and redefined by your adoption into his family. But they say that you are defined by your lusts, not love. Trans identity must supersede all else. The cope requires that you make yourself God and thus judge, jury, and executioner. No longer is human life valuable because we're made in the image of God, but you are instead only valuable if you are remade in the image of their delusion. Transgenderism is a jihadist, self-idolizing religion where the world must be remade to fit their conceptions and all heretics must be violently eradicated.
Trans people are sacred. We are the divine. We're practicing our divinity by expressing authenticity.
We've already seen this in the shootings that took place in Colorado Springs, in Denver, in Aberdeen, in Nashville, or in the assassination attempt on Brett Kavanaugh, or in the countless other lesser examples of violent assault, or in the thousands more examples of people calling for lethal violence online. Despite being such a small percentage of the population, they are overwhelmingly volatile. And the more tangible manifestations of this volatility are only going to become more commonplace. They lash out because normal people remind them of how wrong they are, and they lash inwardly because they're rebelling against their own biology. And if we just decide to let this persist, they will ideologically suicide bomb the Western world. They will never stop trying to get rid of the shame they feel, and the only way they know how to do that is by destroying everyone and everything that stands in their way. Sometimes that means 3 young children and 3 adults at a Christian school whose families will never see them again this side of heaven, and sometimes that means themselves. They're over 80% more likely to consider taking their own lives, and nearly half of them actually try. Even after the surgeries that are supposed to fix all their problems, the suicide rate stays roughly the same, but in certain studies it actually goes up. And for those who choose to detransition, the least commonly cited reason is discrimination. This ideology is so destructive because they are so deeply desperate to get rid of a part of themselves and a part of society that you simply cannot get rid of. And despite the violence, despite the vitriol, despite the predation on young children, these people, at the end of the day, are themselves victims of demonic perversion. But that doesn't mean that they're not dangerous, especially those who commit violent acts or those who coerce young children. There is hope for everyone through the salvation found in Jesus Christ. But that's only through repentance and fully turning away from sin. And for us Christians, us Americans who want this country to grow into something better than the mess we're currently in, we can't for a moment concede on any of these issues, nor fail to acknowledge things as they actually are. Never give in. If it's a fight our spiritual adversaries want, it's a fight they'll get. Do not under any circumstances participate in the charade, and do not concede to their logic or their linguistic framework where they redefine words or cover them with cushy euphemisms to make things easier to swallow. Transgenderism doesn't exist. It's an ideology, but it's not actually real. And it's up to us to renormalize an opposition to the ideology which used to be consensus. Address the issue like it is, not like they want to make it out to be. And don't just think of it as a mental health issue. While all of them develop what could be called mental issues if they didn't have them already, that's not the cause. The men are all perverts and the women are all chronically depressed, but this is a spiritual issue before it's a mental issue. And even though TERFs would tell you this, it's really not a women's equality issue either. I mentioned Riley Gaines earlier in her speeches about the issue, and while I have absolutely nothing against her personally, she and plenty of others have adopted this whole, I'm not anti-trans, I just want women to compete in sports without men argument, which is like saying, I'm not anti-weeds, I just want to grow my flowers without them in the garden. Well, I hate to break it to you, but so long as there are weeds just outside the garden, they will eventually work their way in regardless. If this becomes the popular counter-argument, which doesn't condemn the idea itself, it's really not going to get us anywhere. And let's be honest, no one really cared about women's sports before men started competing in them. The men who try to white knight and make their whole platform about, we need to protect women from men infiltrating their sports, they're just grifting. Yes, of course, men competing in women's sports is wrong, but it's wrong because there is a man pretending to be a woman. And if we lose sight of that, we lose sight of everything. And it's not all just some big misunderstanding either. Never get suckered into pretending that all ideas are equally valuable. There is right and there is wrong. And in this case, the difference is a matter of life and death. We can't just sit back and let this one slide. It's not about politics. This is about the truth. And if we can't stand for the truth, we can't stand for anything. Just like the people deceived by this ideology, we can turn this country around if we reconcile with the truth and speak out against the ills of our current society. But if we don't have the gall to say enough is enough, it will only get worse. These ideas didn't come from nowhere. They weren't just magically normalized one day. They come from a long trend of undiagnosed decay. And if we want to continue getting to the bottom of this, we have to understand what laid the groundwork for transgenderism, what initially corroded our ideas about sex and identity, and how we as men failed to stop it. I know I'm not the first one to say this, but the Walt Disney Company is lying to you. They may sell themselves under the pretense of fun, nostalgia, and magic, but underneath, they're doing something much more sinister. Take their theme parks, for example. They call Disney World the most magical place on earth because, unlike your basic amusement parks that might have little tidbits of theming here or there, they call Disney magical because everything is designed to make you feel like you're in, well, another world. You're completely insulated from the outside, and everything is precisely engineered to reinforce that separation. Everyone knows it's not real, but so long as you are inside the fishbowl, surrounded by the sights, the smells, the sounds, down to the sight lines and facades cleverly constructed to make the whole thing appear larger than life, it feels real. So long as the illusion is in your face, it's hard to see anything other than the reality presented to you. But the illusion isn't perfect. All it takes is for the ride to stop and for the lights to come on inside Space Mountain, and all of a sudden, you're no longer flying through the stars, you're just pinned down in your seat amidst a jungle gym of metal trussing, only now realizing you're a lot less comfortable than you were when everything was moving along according to plan and you were distracted by the blinding lights and mind-numbing sounds. Even though everyone knows Disney World is fake while they're on the inside, it's hard to tell where reality ends and the fabrication begins. But this isn't limited to just a few theme parks. Disney, along with countless other corporations and politicians who decide the trajectory of American culture, are trying to manipulate our reality to their design, not just inside a theme park, but in the real world too. Social media, movies, TV, and news media are all in a coordinated effort to spoon-feed poison to the American people disguised as something fun and innocuous. Our very reality is being changed as those in power feed us lies to make sure we pose as little a threat to their power as possible. And the most effective way they do this is by destroying the family, eroding our social cohesion and manipulating the population into sexual degeneracy. And what can be more anti-family than destroying the meaning of family through the normalization of homosexuality? Just listen to what Richard Nixon had to say about its destructive nature.
They were glorifying homosexuality. The point that I make is that, goddamn, I do not think that you glorify on public television homosexuality. You ever see what happened? You know what happened to the Greeks? Homosexuality destroyed them. Sure, Aristotle was a homo. We all know that. But with Socrates, he never had the influence of television. The last 6 Roman emperors, you see, homosexuality, immorality in general, these are the enemies of strong societies. That's why the communists and the left-wingers are pushing each other, trying to destroy us.
Just like you'll never know how much of it is fake inside a fabricated theme park until you get a glimpse behind the facade, you'll never know how many termites are in the floorboards on which you walk until you start to pull them up. Our country, the United States of America, and along with it the entire Western world, is plagued by the stinking rot of sexual degeneracy that festers behind layers upon layers of manipulation and social engineering. It's become so bad that while we're desperately fighting all that trans nonsense we discussed earlier, we've all but given up and accepted the trends that led to that phenomenon in the first place. You don't get T or Q or I, A, X, Y, Z, M, A, P plus without first getting L and G and B. Homosexuality and all its associated forms are inherently antithetical to conserving what this nation stands for and directly contributive to its decline. Disney's contributions to our media are leading the charge when it comes to normalizing this kind of sexual deviancy through popular culture, but they are far from the only ones pushing this narrative. This narrative that homosexuality is normal is spewed from the lips of pundits, presidents, and cartoon characters alike, all in an effort to lull us into accepting our own self-destruction. All according to plan. Because people have a natural aversion to the LGBT, because everyone understands innately that it's disgusting and unnatural, they have to create an illusion in order for it to be accepted. They take something which is healthy for a nation like marriage or family and appropriate it so to create an association between something prosperous with something suicidal. They want to play pretend and act like cutting off bloodlines, indulging debauchery, and destroying the body and mind is a good thing, actually. But it's all a lie. It's so devious a lie that it's even started to become accepted in so-called conservative circles. But if you cannot conserve the meaning of family, the very backbone of strong societies, you can't conserve anything. Just recently on Memorial Day, of all days, Texas Senator Ted Cruz tweeted some big mopey statement lamenting about how barbaric it was for the president of Uganda to criminalize homosexuality with the threat of a little bit of jail time and treat aggravated homosexuality, aka child molestation, with capital punishment. And like any neocon warhawk who still believes in American unipolarity where we enforce liberal democracy and its associated vices onto the world, I'd even venture to guess he believes it anti-freedom and un-American. Gear up, boys. We're dropping into Uganda. Gonna raise up that pride flag just like Iwo Jima before we let them backwards Christian extremists preserve their national dignity and their own children's innocence. Hoorah! This is the state of modern conservative discourse, infiltrated by libertarian abstractions and effeminacy. It's a far cry from Nixon or any historical conservatism for that matter. We've been totally infiltrated. It isn't just leftoids or normies that have taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. The movement that should by all means oppose these trends now conforms to them. Just as Christ teaches us, a man cannot serve two masters, but any Christian or conservative who isn't openly opposing this lifestyle is doing just that. But why? How did this happen? How did this lie fester for so long that it's become so widely accepted even among conservatives? Well, like in many cases, society begins to destabilize long before the problems are up in our faces. It starts much more subtly than that when we begin to redefine our morals through changing language. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. Once the lines between good and evil, acceptable and unacceptable become blurry, everything begins to unravel. The forces pushing this narrative insist gays are just like anyone else. We used to call this sexual preference, but now they assert that it be called sexual orientation in order to remove any and all personal responsibility for these inclinations. Not only that, but they believe said orientation to be an independent, isolated part of someone's life that doesn't affect anything else. What does it matter what two consenting adults do behind closed doors? It's none of your business. Love is love after all, and who are you to say someone else's love is invalid? Even Joe Biden peddles this narrative.
My dad was dropping me off. I remember about to get out of the car and I looked to my right, two well-dressed men in suits. They gave each other a kiss. I turned and looked at my dad. He said, Joey, it's simple. They love each other. It's simple. No, I'm not joking.
Does he really expect us to believe that his dad was telling him love is love back in the 1950s? Especially considering he used to be staunchly against defining marriage as anything apart from one man and one woman?
The world's going to Hades in a handbasket. I can't believe the American people can't see through this. We already have a law, the Defense of Marriage Act, where we've all voted, not where I voted and others said, look, marriage is between a man and a woman and states must respect that. What's the game going on here?
I don't know what that to say. Wow, Democrats are so hypocritical, because that doesn't get us anywhere. But it is indicative of just how quickly and monumentally the cultural narratives have changed. Even Republicans in Congress today are more accepting of gay marriage than even Democrats just over a decade ago. That's the prevalent narrative. It's become so pervasive so quickly that any serious conservative should look on and harbor tremendous concern. For the vast majority of American history, being attracted to the same sex was relegated to the private fetishes of a select few, and despised in the rare case it ever came to light in public. But through the efforts of our enemies in the 20th and 21st centuries, we have seen a population whose views differ unrecognizably to that of their forefathers. It's been less than a decade since the Supreme Court made it legal for gays to pretend to get married, and in such a short time, we've gone from equal marriage rights to gay fetishes in the streets, child transitioning, and the push for pedophilia, and most Western nations, including our own, denouncing their own national flag in favor of this one. First it's, we just want to be accepted. Then it's, why can't we just get married? Then it's, now that we're pretending to get married, you have to let us purchase children. Then it's, you have to allow us to indoctrinate your children, and if not, we'll have them taken from you. And I think it goes without saying what they actually plan on doing with said children. The agenda does not stop, because this is their way of reproducing. It's like trying to subsist off a non-renewable resource. You can't sustain yourself off a natural system, so you have to corrupt, deplete, and expand elsewhere ad infinitum. And this is exactly the corrosive and all-consuming nature of sin that we've been talking about. There's no compartmentalizing sexuality within a person. It affects their entire being. And in the same way, there's no compartmentalizing sexual decay within one part of society. It must consume everything. And even though any normal person wouldn't stand for any of this, our society has become so effeminate, so passive, that the propaganda redefining this issue goes entirely unquestioned. Everything about this issue is misleading, and that's by design. Even the name is misleading. Homosexual sounds like a scientific classification of equal value to heterosexual, but really it has nothing to do with sex, only the fruitless mockery of sex we call sodomy. Sex creates life. Sodomy creates nothing but death and decay. That's why it's imperative we call things like they are. Reclaiming our language, reframing these issues through reality, not delusion, won't fix everything instantly, but it's the best place to start. It's better to get rid of all the toxic chemicals under the sink, but for now we at least have to acknowledge the warning labels before our infantile and sin-loving society finds a way to chug them all down in one gulp. The euphemisms used to coat this issue have purposely made their agenda easier to swallow, no pun intended, which has reprogrammed an entire generation of totally apathetic men whose natural disgust instincts have been sidelined. Not just soy-brain leftists either, even conservatives fall prey to this. But if we have any hope that our movement might change this country for the better, we can't stand by thinking that the stinking rot decaying the rest of the country is going to treat us any differently. Like trans ideology, the first of the foundational lies about the gays is that it's just who they are. They were just born that way, so if you disagree, you're attacking them personally. They're just like normal people after all. Well, do normal people all of a sudden become incapable of retaining their own excrement because their anal sphincter gets worn out? Or do normal people have a lifespan of about 50 years?
What is the gayest piece of science you know?
Gay men were getting food poisoning at 3 times the rate of the rest of society. And they realize it's because we're eating so much and it's a fecal oral bacterial transmission.
Is it really just an isolated identity when we've witnessed how quickly they want this to be widely accepted in every crevice of society? You may be able to point to exceptions of based gay people who countersignal certain talking points of the radical pride movement, but their identity is still wrapped up in the fact that they like using someone of the same sex to carnally gratify themselves. Oh, you're a gay conservative because you don't like those other gays, even though you still make sure everyone knows that you're gay, which somehow gives you license to speak authoritatively on issues concerning the downward trajectory of this country, which you're actively contributing to. You're not just lying to others, you're lying to yourself. This issue is not about who people are deep down. They may make it their whole identity, but that's their choice. Johns Hopkins, among many others, have stated that despite a plethora of research, there's actually no evidence to suggest you're born gay. In every single case, that choice may be informed by coercion, abuse, or possibly hormonal deficiencies, but there's always a point of intervention that disrupts the natural course of human sexuality. Otherwise, it would cease to exist, which is why it will never stay behind closed doors. It's clawing to be let loose and wreak havoc because at the end of the day, it's sin. And not just any sin, but a sin which redefines the self completely. All sin is all-consuming so long as you continue to indulge the sin. But unlike stealing or lying or even murder, sexual sin has a propensity to quickly overtake the mind. Sexual sin, especially sodomy, is a transgression against your own body first and foremost, before it is against someone else's. Some progressive Christians will try to argue that it's not sin, but they're also just perpetuating the lie. Even if you refrain from looking at scripture for a moment, because I know that's a big ask for you progressives, let's be real. If it looks like sin, if it sounds like sin, if it tastes like sin, it's probably sin. But besides the observable fact that it plays out exactly like sin, scripture is abundantly clear that sodomy is an abomination to God and completely contrary to how he defines marriage. Nice choice of words there, Ted Cruz. The very word for sodomy comes from the city of Sodom chronicled in Genesis 19, and I think you'd have a hard time arguing that God wasn't vehemently displeased with their titular behavior, considering the whole wiping them off the face of the earth with a firestorm thing for wanting to lie with men to know them carnally. And if that wasn't enough, it's stated multiple times in the Mosaic Law that adult men sleeping with other adult men is an abomination to God. And it's not just in the Old Testament either. Not only does Jude chapter 1 specifically reiterate the cautionary tale of Sodom and Gomorrah, specifically stating that they were an example of eternal hellfire for those pursuing unnatural sexual desires, but Paul also addresses the issue specifically in Romans chapter 1 and 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And outside of the examples where the Bible says definitively that it's not okay, you can't find anywhere where it says it is okay. Any instance in which God speaks about marriage or where Paul, by the inspiration of God the Spirit, instructs how married people ought to live, it's always in reference to one man and one woman. Now, some people will try to point out that the word homosexual didn't appear in Bibles until 1946, like that's some big gotcha, but every word used prior to the addition of homosexual was either just sodomy or a specific description of what sodomy is. Homosexual is just a more modern way of getting the exact same point across. I think it's slightly less accurate of a word, but in the case of Scripture, it's not any less condemned. God, who created all things, is abundantly clear that he didn't design for this. He didn't design for any sin, but we live in a world in rebellion to his design, so each one of us is born into that rebellion. No one who engages in a sinful lifestyle, gay or otherwise, was made that way by God, but rather deceived into it by Satan. Sin is a choice, but unlike many sins which are momentary and fleeting, sexual sin becomes the sinner's identity and affects every aspect of their life. It doesn't stay hidden behind closed doors. It needs to invade everything. And we should treat it like the threat it is. It's a threat both to the individuals who engage in it and to our society as a whole. If we say that we are concerned about the health and prosperity of a nation, we cannot then say that we don't care if people pursue self-destruction. The well-being of the individual and the well-being of a nation are always intertwined. We don't just legislate against crimes against others like theft or murder, but we also disallow drug abuse and self-harm for these reasons. Or we used to, anyway. Sodomy is just as threatening of a lifestyle to the self. It's no wonder that drug and alcohol abuse and self-harm are already rampant in these communities. But in the rare cases that sort of self-destruction isn't present, you're going to find another kind of self-destruction resultant of the lifestyle itself. Sodomy is to death what intramarital sex is to life. So it's no wonder that despite accounting for 2% of the population, the vast majority of STD cases are made up of sodomites. Of all AIDS cases, which used to be called gay-related immune disorder for a reason, 67% are gays, with gay men accounting for 70% of new HIV cases. The analysis of CDC data from KFF.org puts it this way. While gay men make up just 2% of the population in the US, they account for 2/3 of new HIV infections, a majority of people living with HIV, and more than half of all AIDS deaths since the epidemic's beginning. It's estimated that 12 to 13% of gay and bisexual men in the US are HIV positive, including 1 in 5 in major US cities. Gay men are the only group in the country among whom new infections are on the rise. Between 2008 and 2010, new infections rose 12% overall among gay men and 22% among younger gay men from the ages of 13 to 24. The problem is growing, and there is no cure. It always has been, and probably always will be, a death sentence. And these kinds of stats exist as well with other diseases. I won't rattle off every single one for the sake of time, but you'll find similar gross overrepresentation with intestinal parasites and syphilis, with gays accounting for 70% to 90% of all cases respectively. That's nothing to do with stigma or social attitudes. This is reaping what you sow. It's an unnatural, sinful, and corrosive lifestyle, and the consequences of said lifestyle are abundantly clear. Are we, the people who care about this nation, going to say that we don't allow for such blatant self-destruction, or are we going to keep telling ourselves that it doesn't matter because it doesn't affect us personally? What a selfish and narcissistic way to look at the world, to not care about people's abject squalor and their deep deception brought about because those that preceded us thought the same way that you did. It's pathetic. And even if you can't get behind establishing a moral intolerance to this for the sake of the individual, you can at least get behind it for the sake of the country as a whole. Sodomy doesn't just ruin the individual, it ruins our entire concept of relationships, without which you cannot have interpersonal cohesion as a nation. No longer is the strong force of male fraternity always understood as platonic, it's unduly sexualized. No longer is sex for the purpose of creating life, it's destructive hedonism. No longer is marriage between one man and one woman, it can be anyone. 2 men, 2 women, a fat ugly chick and 5 guys, or a vet tech and her pit mix. Who are you to judge? Once you change the definitions to normalize one type of degeneracy, the floodgates are open and everything becomes fair game. This is by no means a new phenomenon. It makes you wonder why widespread sodomy is historically associated with the downfall of civilizations like Sodom or Gibeah, or even the most powerful ones like Greece and Rome. It also makes you wonder why it was essentially wiped out with the emergence of Christian societies in Europe after the fall of Rome. In fact, the rare case that it was a problem, it was pretty standard for countries to have anti-sodomy laws, just like the ones reinstated in Uganda recently. But as secularism replaced religious precedent during the 19th century, sodomy slowly grew in the shadows of an increasingly immoral Western Europe, and eventually made its way to America. In the 1890s, you start seeing the word homosexual invented for the first time in places like Germany, but it was still a fairly uncommon phenomenon. But like any sin left unchecked, it festered in the background, gaining some prominence in the avant-garde pockets of Western Europe and America in the early 20th century, only to be quelled for a short time when conservative social values resurged during and after World War II. But these values were very surface level. By the time we get to the civil rights movement and the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s, that conservative veneer did extraordinarily little to withstand the powder keg of social upheaval brought about in those decades. The language of equal rights and the riotous practices of the civil rights movement were co-opted to capitalize on the radical momentum generated by the sexual revolution, culminating in the Stonewall riots of 1969, breaking the push for sodomy out of the shadows and into public consciousness. But this was not like the sodomy of ancient times. This time, an attempt was being made to legitimize sodomy as an equal alternative to normality. See, although sodomy has existed since ancient times, it was still understood as a shameful act committed by hedonistic men. Participation, for the most part, particularly on the receiving end, was generally looked down upon. One example that comes to mind is how the political enemies of the great Julius Caesar stoked a rumor that when he was a young ambassador to Bithynia, his extended stay in the king's court must have meant that he had certain sort of relations with the king. His critics began calling him the Queen of Bithynia, and he was thenceforth trounced with accusations of having been shamefully conquered by the foreign king, just not on the battlefield. Does that sound like a favorable conception of the whole idea? At least it wasn't, not until the decline really set in and the decay was rampant. But even as their decadent hedonism tore them apart, it's not like Grecians or Romans thought that two men could move off into the suburbs and have a family just like a man and a woman. It was pretty much universally understood that this was a gross sexual act, not an identity. But now the narrative is different. Now we have social media and mainstream news in our faces all the time to contort our language and redefine our values. Now we call them homosexuals as if to equate them as an alternative to heterosexuals. Now we call them gay marriages as if such a mirage could ever equal the matrimony of a man and woman in reflection of Christ's matrimony to his redeemed church. Now we call them families and parents even though they either have to have kids through surrogacy or straight up purchasing them like little house slaves, subject to inevitable abuse and mental turmoil from being deprived of the mother and father every child needs, being thrust into a highly dysfunctional parody of a household. It's no longer hidden in the shadows. They get a third of the calendar dedicated to them between the whole month of June and all the other days dedicated to them flaunting their fetishes and forcing it down the throats of every man, woman, and child with a pair of eyes. And on top of complete upheaval of social precedent, our very legislation has bound to this agenda. Our own Supreme Court was abused to eradicate the once legally upheld sanctity of marriage in little more than a decade. In 2003, they ruled anti-sodomy laws were unconstitutional, stripping away the rights of states to criminalize the act. In 2013, they struck down part of the Defense of Marriage Act, and in 2015, they tore it to shreds with the legalization of gay marriage nationwide. But do you know when those rulings were decided upon? June 26, 2003, June 26, 2013, and June 26, 2015. Around the summer solstice in the very same month that we have profanely consecrated to the celebration of molestation and depravity, the law of our land was contorted and broken until it was no more. It's the same month that the Stonewall riots occurred in 1969, and it just so happens to be the month that was dedicated to the whore goddess Ashtoreth in the ancient world. As we discussed earlier, while Moloch is the demonic principality of destruction, he is preceded by Ashtoreth, aka Inanna, Ishtar, or Venus, who was not only the goddess of sexuality, androgyny, or rainbows, but the goddess of transformation. In the very month dedicated to the demon goddess of transformation, we've seen our entire view of marriage and sex transformed, and by extension, our entire society. There's a reason she's described as the great prostitute. It is her prerogative to remove sex out of the sanctity of the marriage bed and defile it out in the open. And just like her androgynous priests of old, she is using the sodomites and their agenda to force this unnatural transformation today. Each one of them, whether they know it or not, are agents of this transformation, and we've been totally blind to this reality because the deluge of propaganda we're inundated with online. And not only has that propaganda been used to redefine who these people are, but also what it is they want. The narrative says that they're just like us, they just love different people. They operate just like normal couples, happy, healthy, and monogamous.
Members of my own staff who are in incredibly committed monogamous relationships, same-sex relationships.
But does any of what they say actually line up with what they do? It shouldn't come as a shock at this point, but the reality is basically the exact opposite. They don't want monogamy or a family. That's just a means of legitimizing themselves to people who understand monogamy and family to be a good thing. They prey on our emotions by adopting this disguise, and the average person sees this and thinks, well, if it makes them happy, why shouldn't they be able to do it? But they don't actually want this, and they definitely aren't happy and satisfied people. Maybe some of them think that they want that, but they're just lying to themselves or coping. The reality tells a very different story. Most of them don't want to pretend to get married despite the whole push for equal rights. And pretend marriage or cohabitation ends up being highly dysfunctional because when you try to construct a home life around a farcical imitation, it just doesn't work. When two people of the same sex cohabitate and try to assume the roles of a man and a woman, they are incapable of replicating that dynamic because they lack the complementary natures of men and women. Men carnally have a very high sex drive and a desire for variety, so men with other men are highly promiscuous and bodily destructive. Do you really want to tell me that gay people want to be monogamous just like normal people when the modal range for number of lifetime partners is 101 to 500? 101 to 500 different sexual partners in a single lifetime. True monogamy means only one, but the average for normal people in our sexualized culture is around 8. And for more than 1/4 of gay men, the number of partners is over 1,000. And of all lifetime partners, 80% of gay men said that half of them were strangers. Sounds real fulfilling of a way to live life, doesn't it? Women, on the other hand, desire security from men, but are also catty and aggressive with other women. So when you put two women together, they're both incapable of providing the security they so desire, which only a man can fulfill. So they become incredibly insecure and often violently aggressive. Nearly half of lesbians claim abuse in their relationships, but that's only what's documented. For gay men, it's around 26%, but that's also the exact same rate of gay men who call the police when they're being abused. There's no telling how much higher those metrics actually are, especially if newer research were to be conducted as these problems grow commonplace. But that doesn't happen as much anymore because it's homophobic to do that. In any case, you don't need stats or data to know that this is dysfunctional and unnatural because we recognize this deep down. Otherwise, why would they be trying so hard to convince us that it's normal through propaganda? And when it comes to propaganda, the younger you are, the less the propaganda has to make sense. And this rampant dysfunction gets so much worse when you throw poor, innocent children into the mix. As mentioned, the only reason gays want to pretend to get married and have a family is because that appropriation is used to legitimize their degeneracy to people who innately understood marriage and procreation to be good things. As a byproduct, those institutions are shattered by their undefining. And the same goes for children. Everyone knows that sodomites can't procreate. They can only groom or abuse children into perpetuating their sodomy. In the case of gay marriage, they're basically doing this in the form of family face, which requires them not only to steal from children, depriving him or her of a loving family and a normal life, but also to literally steal a child for their own selfish ambitions. In an attempt to prove that they have the same desires and capabilities as normal people, they go so far as to ruin the life of a young child to perpetuate their own delusion. It's selfish, abusive, and disgusting, and all a part of their effort to unnaturally establish themselves as normal people. There are more couples on the wait list for adoption in this country than there are kids available for adoption. But we decide to give some of those kids away into false households where they will inevitably be abused either verbally, physically, or sexually. Everyone thinks that pedophilia is the next thing the alphabet people want to add to their acronym, but historically, pedophilia and sodomy saw very little distinction. The two were never separate issues, and they aren't now. Pedophilia is rampant among sodomites because, again, this is how they reproduce. I mentioned how bad the promiscuity is, but I didn't mention that those stats don't exclude minors. Even though gays are 2% of the population, they account for over 1/3 of child sex offenses. When you compare pedophiles to the rest of the population, same-sex attraction can be anywhere from 6 to 20 times higher. And of the population of male pedophiles, 42% are engaged in same-sex molestation. Just as the propaganda targets kids, so does the abuse, because this is necessary for their self-perpetuation. If no gays were pedophiles, gays would cease to exist in a generation or two, because they're certainly not having kids of their own. That's why standing up for the innocence of children is so reviled by them. Getting children on board is tantamount to their affront to simply continue existing in their degeneracy. So not only is the propaganda used to completely warp our understanding of who they are, what it is they want, but it also redefines what sex is. Once you stop defining sex and marriage as exclusively pertaining to a married man and woman subject to God for the purpose of procreation and bonding, everything becomes fair game. Sex, which is the consummation of bride and groom, is one of, if not the closest tangible example we have on earth of Christ's unification with the church. But it has never been so defiled as it is right now. The unity of man and woman, the sacrificial love between a husband and a wife, becoming one flesh and having children are foundational to the cohesion and prosperity of a society because it is rooted in the foundation laid by Christ and God's command to be fruitful and multiply. It's deeply spiritual. But what the sexual revolution and the normalization of homosexuality has done is turn consummation into a frivolous and purely physical act. What was once a spiritual interaction is now just a carnal transaction. When you decouple the spiritual element, it becomes much easier to remove the moral framework keeping everything in its proper place. But now the very definitions of these things have been changed. We've forgotten so quickly that gay marriage isn't marriage, it's just mirage. Gay sex is not sex, it's sodomy, and gay love isn't love, it's nothing but lust and lies. These elusive euphemisms directly contribute to the slow descent into vulgar meaninglessness. Even before sodomy was normalized, sex was transformed from a beautiful and holy thing to a casual, even dirty thing, catalyzed by the changing of language. We don't use reverent words like consummation or even other ones like making love anymore. We use bang, screw, smash, lay pipe, and most often the F word, a guttural vowel and abrasive consonant, creating a phonetic whiplash reflective of the violent frivolity sex is treated with in a secular framework. It's not even sex in the sense that you're giving yourself up for someone else anymore. You're just using someone else's body to masturbate with. And in the case of sodomy, it's using another man's rectal cavity. Sounds pretty gross when you say it like that, because it is. It's disgusting, it's vile, it's nothing but death and decay, and it has begotten nothing but death and decay. Real sex is holy and life-giving. Real sex is symbolic of the consummation of Christ in church. It is fruitful and beautiful, and if we can't conserve that, we can't conserve anything. If we want this country to survive, we can't for a second tolerate anything incongruous with a Christian moral framework. Only under such a framework can we truly guarantee things like liberty, not to do as one pleases, but liberty from the slavery of sin, and guarantee the security and prosperity of the family. Sodomy is diametrically opposed to all of these, and the battle against it stands as one of the most crucial beachheads in the war on family and our society. And let's not forget, we are at war. It is paramount that we start taking threats as threats, not pussyfooting with this enemy of my enemy nonsense. We love and pray for people deceived into this lifestyle, yes, but we also abhor that lifestyle, and we shouldn't want it anywhere near us and our children. It's not personal. It's just calling things like they are. It's not personal because they're not just born that way, but they make it personal by claiming that as their identity, thus they can no longer coexist with anyone who disagrees. This identity is wrapped up in sin. It's highly dysfunctional relationally and societally, and it's fundamentally untruthful. How can you expect truth or integrity from someone living a lie every single waking moment? Most importantly, we have to acknowledge that this is not simply physical, but spiritual. Just like transvestism, this is driven by the demonic. The end goal may be total destruction, but this is the transformation that must occur first. And they've been largely successful at this. The Overton window has shifted heavily in the favor of these issues, to the point where there are even gays and trannies siding with conservatives against the radical woke LGBT agenda, but those people are only double agents. Any sexual degeneracy is a threat to our goals, especially in this case when it's a perverse mockery of sex. We must stand firm on the truth, on the meaning of sex, the sanctity of marriage, the protection of children, if we want to conserve the Christian principles so integral to this nation. There is only hope, both for our nation and for those deceived into this lifestyle, found in bold and unbridled truth, spoken in love. We have to be vigilant, not only in speaking the truth, but in identifying the lies. If we do not combat the propaganda insulating young people from their natural intuition and coercing them into self-destruction, our nation will cease to exist. Just like we talked about earlier, we see significantly higher rates of LGBT identification among generations who grew up online. And that's no coincidence, and we need to fight back, even if the apathy of prior generations has landed us on the back foot. Repentance is vital. Anyone deceived into a life of sodomy can be set free, but they must repent of their sins, just like we must repent of our own failure to stand up for the truth. All must turn and acknowledge Jesus Christ as Lord, and acknowledge that all truth is defined by God alone. Otherwise, things will only get worse. As Paul tells us in Romans 1, even though they are themselves deceived, they're still held accountable. They know it's wrong, we know it's wrong, so what are we doing still tolerating it? We need to re-stigmatize being a sodomite. We need to re-establish that there are plenty of normal people who understand this to be gross and unnatural. These things used to be gatekept by social taboos, which have always been far more powerful than legislation. But those societal standards are only upheld when godly men exercise the authority necessary to curb deviancy. Men are supposed to lead, but our men have become so pacified and weak that there is hardly anyone left to defend the truth. When men are apathetic, women and children are left to be preyed upon by emotional manipulation and deception. There are many godly women fighting the good fight out there, but the reality is that you all aren't made with the same rationality and protective instincts that men have in order to be the leaders of a society. We need godly men to take a stand again, to oppose the attack on us and our families on all fronts. No more apathy, no more being quiet or nice. It's time to take a stand. Because without strong men, and with the whims of deceived women to dictate the direction of society, everything falls apart. Allow me to tell you a little story. Once upon a time, there was a noble knight. I'm talking the whole shebang: shiny armor, mighty sword, and trusty steed. And as legend would have you believe, a majestic mane of golden brown locks, which is purely coincidental. One day, this honest knight receives word that a fair princess has been taken captive in a far-off countryside, locked away in a perilous tower and guarded by a ruthless ogre. Upon hearing this, our dear knight, with, of course, no hesitation or expectation for reward, springs into action to rescue the poor princess. After a 3 days ride, he finds himself gazing upon the tower, which is perilous indeed, but of course, no match for our knight's cunning. Seeing a small open window atop the tower, he begins to make his ascent, thinking surely no ogre would expect such a clever entrance. After a daring ascent, heaving stone after stone, he reaches the window, throws himself in, and looks up to see none other than the captive princess, with no hint of delight in her eyes, only a look of unsettled bewilderment, perhaps even disgust. Thinking her perhaps only to be startled, our knight pronounces, "My fair lady, fear not, for I have come to rescue." But before he can even finish, he sees the door behind the princess. It's slightly ajar. It's not even locked. How could this princess be locked away if the ogre doesn't even lock the doors? Suddenly, the doors swing open and in walks the ogre, looking not quite like a vicious beast, only like another woman, rather fat and ugly.
"What do you think you're doing here?"
she hisses. "I've come to save the princess," he replies, dumbfounded.
"Save? What business is it of yours to say she needs saving? She's quite happy here. In fact, she chose to be here. She's not gonna let some man tell her where she can or cannot be, ain't that right, dearie?"
"It's true,"
affirms the princess.
"I'm much more liberated here than under the yoke of you oppressive men."
"It's about time for you to be leaving us now,"
declares the overseer. But hark well, foul creature." But before he can even begin to retort, before he can even draw his sword, the sheer enormity of the ogre lady comes rushing towards him, thrusting him back out the window with a long, terrible fall in which he has but a moment to wonder, where did I go wrong? His crime was no lack of bravery nor chivalry, no shortcoming in strength of hand nor courage of heart. It was that he, a man, dared to even notice that the princess was in danger and thought that he had an obligation to save her, even in spite of her wishes. But make no mistake, lords and ladies, this is not merely the stuff of fiction. This is the reality of the world we live in today. A world which believes in toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity.
Our world believes that for men to be the leaders, protectors, and providers for society is unfair, exploitative, and oppressive, and in need of radical change.
Can you imagine the cultural changes we could make?
We have to change the conversation.
Updating the man box.
Change the societal expectations currently placed on men.
We need to move towards a new version of masculinity.
Find ways to denormalize toxic masculinity.
Despite there being plenty of men out there who you may consider to be toxic, men who use the qualities of their sex to manipulate and exploit, and quite frankly, plenty of women who act similarly for that matter, this is in every case due to a lack of masculinity, not the presence of it. Toxic masculinity doesn't actually exist, and the notion that it does, that we somehow need to change men, is changing the fabric of our society to our detriment. Instead of expecting men to strive for greatness, our society condemns any form of male aspiration for good or for ill, because we've been trained to believe that the things which have always been good for our society are actually an evil. We're suffering from an autoimmune disorder where the cells of our civilization have become so confused that they start attacking the self instead of the disease. And of course we're confused. We can't even define what is a woman or what is a man or how they're supposed to relate to each other. The average person has become so inundated with disorder that they view order with hostility. And that's no coincidence. If men are to establish order and protect those in need, anyone with a desire to insidiously lord over us would want none of that. They would want to divide the sexes against each other, to conflate them, confuse them, and destroy them entirely. Because they know that men and women need each other. And when we are separated, when we are unmade, disorder and chaos abound with no one to threaten their control. Especially when you convince people that threatening that control is toxic and that we should all be quite happy with the disorder that we live in. but it's our job to restore order nonetheless. It's our job to retrieve what it really means for men to be masculine, what it really means for women to be feminine, and how those are inherent goods, and anything toxic is simply what falls short of those standards. We need to recover an understanding of femininity, and especially of masculinity, that understands them correctly. And to even begin to do that, we need to go back to the beginning. Let me tell you another story. A long time ago, long before knights and princesses, there was one man and one woman, Adam and Eve. The God and creator of all things, who made the heavens and the earth and all the creatures on the earth, made man and woman to inhabit this world. Man came first, created by God's own hand in his image for his glory, tasked with a purpose to rule over, steward, and protect God's creation. But the man Adam was alone, and God thought that he shouldn't be alone. So from Adam's rib, God fashioned with his own hand Eve, the woman, the image and glory of man and of God by extension, tasked with the purpose to help Adam fulfill his mission. And so long as they did not disobey God and eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they would continue and prosper in this created dynamic of cooperation, which God said was very good. As Matthew Henry put it, the woman was made out of a rib out of the side of Adam, not made out of his head to rule over him, nor out of his feet to be trampled upon by him, but out of his side to be equal with him, under his arm to be protected, near his heart to be beloved. The woman was of no less value than the man, but she was subject to him as the man was subject to God, a melody and a harmony, a leader and a follower under one conductor. She was also distinct from man, and though pursuing the same goals, they both assumed distinct roles congruent with the unique characteristics as God had designed them. They were, as men and women still are, complementary, not interchangeable. But for Satan, the author of confusion, this simply would not do. He wasn't just going to let God's perfect order persist with man and woman living on in harmony. No. This was going to have to change. But that change would necessitate the woman taking the lead and the man abdicating his role as protector. Though Adam and Eve's sin in taking the forbidden fruit was their disobedience, it was characterized by this inversion of roles. Eve was the one deceived, but Adam did nothing to intervene. He was right there as she took of the fruit and offered it to him. He was responsible for her protection, yet he did nothing. And this is exactly what Satan wants. Satan fears godly men taking up their proper role. Satan loves to tempt us to sabotage these roles, leaving the helpless without protection, without reason, and without order. Satan wants us to think that this is toxic. But Adam's sin wasn't that he was overly chivalrous or cavalier, it's that he was ineffective in taking up his role, leaving Eve to succumb to deception. This inversion is addressed in the curses God declares on Adam and Eve at their banishment from the garden. He declares that Adam will eat by hard labor, by the sweat of his brow, and that Eve will experience great pain in childbirth. These aren't arbitrary. They're specific to what Adam and Eve were purposed for prior to the fall, but now after the fall, they would be sources of pain. He also says that the woman shall desire to rule over her husband, and he shall rule over her nonetheless. Adam's primacy was already established before the fall, but now that will be a source of strife like it was not intended to be. This strife was not what God had designed, but he himself, being always just and truthful, states the reality, a reality we are all too familiar with today, that rebellious sin has such consequences. But all was not lost. God also declared that from the woman's seed would come a man to set things right. This is Jesus Christ, who was fully God and fully man, who lived a sinless life, died in our place to reconcile sinful mankind with a sinless God, and defeated death itself in his resurrection. He is the new man, the new Adam. He fulfilled his role as king and protector, redeeming where Adam failed, and did so with full submission to the Father's will, resisting Satan's temptation, redeeming where Eve had failed. Christ embodies perfect self-sacrificial masculinity as God designed. And when men emulate Christ's masculinity, women are free to be truly feminine as God designed. When men fail to live up to this, women are satanically tempted to take authority, and we get chaos. Christ's self-sacrificial love for the church is the model for the roles which men and women should aspire to in the new covenant. Our respective natures are not done away with, but they are renewed and redeemed. Paul lays out how this dynamic functions in a marriage in Ephesians 5, where he says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as also Christ is head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of the water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. And in Colossians 3, wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be bitter toward them. Now, it's important to make a distinction here when it comes to submission, because this is in the context of a marriage. There's no scriptural basis for all women submitting to all men, but no one's really advocating for that anyway. And there's also no scriptural basis for women being under no authority at all. Women are under the headship of a father until given to be under the headship of a husband, or in the case of celibacy for full-time ministry, under the headship of a spiritual father like a priest or pastor. One of the key points in Paul's writings is maintaining these distinctions between men and women, which he reinforces by appealing not merely to cultural context, but also to the enduring natures demonstrated by Adam and Eve that are encoded in us, their descendants. Consider 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul writes about head coverings and hair length. He writes, "Man is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor is man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things are from God. Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for covering." And yeah, I'll take a second to address the elephant in the room, because whenever I bring up that passage, people are very quick to point out, whether in good faith or not, that I have long hair. I promise this is relevant. Bear with me. But to anyone who says that I have long hair, how do you define long? Is it 6 inches, 8 inches, 12? Where do you draw the line? You have to remember that Paul isn't writing to a population who went to sports clips every month to get the number 6 special. For Paul and pretty much all of human history, long hair, which women wore, was down their backsides, all the way down to their hips sometimes. Men, by contrast, had shorter hair comparatively, but it wasn't this close crop standard that we've gotten used to since the Industrial Revolution. The historical hair standards for men and women looked a lot more like Aragorn and Arwen than your average Black Rifle Coffee Company consumer. I can't tell you the exact quantitative length of how long is too long, but I think our judgment of what that means is helped a lot by the real point of what Paul is getting at with dishonor, and that's effeminacy. If we understand the historical and cultural context in the pagan temples that were all over the Roman Empire, especially Corinth, both men and women would veil their heads, creating an androgynous population of idol worshippers. There were also women who served as temple prostitutes who shaved their heads, as Paul addresses earlier in the passage. Paul instead says that Christians should make a distinction: women wearing head coverings and men not growing their hair to an effeminate length, which is a lot longer than we think of as long hair. I have pretty normal hair historically, and so does Christ, and we can't really classify that as too long because he was perfect. But a man with hair down his torso, that's kind of pushing it. Not just because of the length, but because it's effeminate. It's like how some people will say men don't cry, as if David and Jesus didn't, and millions of men throughout history who are far manlier than the men don't cry guys. That's why it's so important to orient our definitions of masculinity around Christ. Otherwise, it's all arbitrary and subjective. This might seem like a tangent, but all of these standards, head covering, hair length, submission, and authority, they're all built upon and practically reinforce the universal reality that men and women are complementary, meant for distinct roles which are all in service of one another and to God, and they are not interchangeable. Men are expected to be leaders, not because that's a luxury, it's extremely burdensome. You're responsible for everything, even what you're not guilty of. It's your life that's expected to be put on the line for your family every single time. There's a lot of pressure that comes in leading well, but men are uniquely designed to endure that pressure and to aspire to take it on. Women likewise have much asked of them to submit and help and support, but they are inclined to do so and flourish when they take on that role. It's mutual self-sacrifice. We are both expected to deny the self, but in turn we receive something that we never could have otherwise, because men and women complement each other. But only if the roles are different. And they should be different, because we are made differently. It's a total disservice to women to tell them to do men's work, to push them into it, insisting that that's what they want when they've always desired something else. I have a couple of friends with young kids, and I recall them describing how their boys, who are like 5 and 7, I think, they still think girls are icky, but their youngest daughter, who's only like 3 or 4, plays house with their dolls like she's their mother and has already asked when she can get married because she wants to so badly. You don't teach that, it's innate. But instead of fostering that, our society, especially our school system, works overtime to convince girls to suppress those innate desires. Boys have it even worse. Our entire school system is designed to beat any sense of adventure or chivalry out of them. And coupled with the way that women are compelled to act nowadays, why would they want to slay the dragon and save the princess when the princess has a higher body count than the number of knights at the round table? Traditional roles always have been and still are the basis for prosperous, Christ-centered societies, and that necessity was understood pretty much universally in the Western world. That is, until we stop centering our societies around Christ. Ironically, it was Christian views of men and women that freed the world from the atrocities of paganism. Yet now, as the world has become more unchristian, we look at those values as archaic and oppressive, despite the growing instability and unhappiness we experience from removing them. Here's how Jonathan Van Maren summarizes atheist historian Tom Holland's observations. While studying the ancient world, Holland writes, he realized something. Simply, the ancients were cruel, their values utterly foreign to him. The Spartans routinely murdered imperfect children. The bodies of slaves were treated like outlets for the physical pleasure of those with power. Infanticide was common. The poor and the weak had no rights. How do we get from there to here? It was Christianity, Holland writes. Christianity revolutionized sex and marriage, demanding that men control themselves and prohibiting all forms of rape. Christianity confined sexuality within monogamy. It's ironic, Holland writes, that these are now the very standards for which Christianity is derided. Christianity elevated women. In short, Christianity utterly transformed the world. In fact, Holland points out that without Christianity, the Western world would not exist. Even the claims of the social justice warriors who despise the faith of their ancestors rest upon a foundation of Christian values. Those who make arguments based on love, tolerance, and compassion are borrowing fundamentally Christian arguments. If the West had not become Christian, Holland writes, no one would have gotten woke. Besides the misnomer that tolerance is a Christian virtue, he's pretty much correct. Once you remove Christ, you revert to the chaos that came before. Even if you maintain similar values, they lose all meaning and eventually disappear. Specifically when it comes to our definitions of the masculine and feminine, as soon as you remove Christ as the model for male leadership, but also for the submission expected of men to God and woman to father or husband, our definitions and expectations for masculinity and femininity start to slip into those ancient ruts that our original mother and father found themselves in. Men start to become less of men and therefore more like women, and women start becoming less of women and therefore more like men. This inversion, this androgenization has been there since Adam and Eve, but always quelled by the safety net of Christian patriarchy. But as secularism replaced widespread Christian conviction in the West, it began to grow and take on a name: feminism. Before we continue, I want to preface the rest of this video with a few things. It's not to go without saying for anyone who knows me, but for those who don't, I love women, okay? Like, a lot. I'm addressing the issue of feminism because I care about women and their well-being, and feminism is destroying us both. But to address feminism properly, I'm required to be really honest about the nature of men and especially of women. And because our effeminate society has been running cover for women's sin for so long, addressing it will inevitably cause offense. But to love something is to know it deeply as it is, not to pretend that it's something else. Our society for generations has told women that they can have it all, they can be whatever they want, they deserve it all. But when someone like me comes along and says, no, you can't be anything you want, you don't deserve it all, there's actually a certain way that God designed you for a certain purpose, it's going to ruffle some feathers. Also note that in speaking of the natures of men and women and how that plays out practically, I will be using generalizations, but that doesn't make any of it less true. Exceptions are really what make the rule. I know certain women will hear what I have to say and think, well, I'm not like that. That doesn't mean that most women aren't, or that men are no less capable of the same shortcomings. After all, effeminacy will be a big topic of discussion. But I'd also wager that basically all the exceptions as to how women tend to act are because they have a strong masculine figure in their life, whether a father or a husband. I heard that a guy once did a comparison of men's self-help books with women's self-help books, and he found that the men's books were filled to the brim with instruction phrases like, you have to blank. Yet none of the women said that. They were instead filled with phrases like, you deserve. It's all nonsense. It may feel good, but it's not true. I, as a man in brotherly love, am here to tell you, maybe for the first time in a long time, you need to, rather than you are, then fill in the blank with shallow flattery. And for the guys, you need to reinforce this. You need to do a better job of standing up for your masculinity in a world that wants you to be something else. It's the woman's nature to desire to rule over men, but it's the man's nature to want to abdicate that role and just let it happen. Listen, if we want to make any progress around here, some of the guys are going to have to stop going belly up on me and lay down the law a little bit, and some of the women are going to have to learn their place. I will inevitably be called a sexist or a misogynist for these things, but I don't care. I'm saying this because I love women and I love men, and I think either have been done a great disservice by a society which pretends that women don't have flaws and it's all the fault of the toxic men. To say otherwise may feel like ripping a band-aid off, but hey, somebody had to do it. I am the chosen one. Feminism is so ubiquitous in our society that you can't cut away with the cancer without striking a few nerves. So before you click away or you go down to the comments, please consider what I have to say in full, watch the end of the video, think about it, pray about it, and try to view it in the light that everything that I'm saying is only foreign to modern ears, but pretty banal by any historical standard. If you think I'm out of line, I dare you to look up what Thomas Aquinas and Augustine have to say about women. Listen, I'm just trying to stop the world from killing itself here, and slaying the serpent of feminism is chief among the means by which we will begin to make things right. But what exactly is feminism? Feminism has always claimed to be the effort of making men and women equal in the eyes of the law in our society, but we already had that in Christian society. In reality, it's anything but that. Feminism is the rejection of men and the enslavement of women. It's not about equality of the sexes, it never has been. It is the self-imposed destruction contingent on inverting the sexes, thereby completely dismantling how our civilization functions. And the longer it festers, the longer we let it corrode our definitions of masculine and feminine so it can take power amidst the chaos, the more we will be undefined and unsexed insanity, living vacuous, unfulfilling lives, unprotected from deep spiritual deception. And the more feminist we become, the more we've abolished traditional toxic masculinity, the more we've devolved by every conceivable metric. Liberated liberal women who slave away for big corporations and have plants and pit bulls instead of kids and husbands are living measurably unhappier lives. Despite some notion of like increased material success, all you have to do is look at the rise of the sale of antidepressants, which don't actually work, by the way, to see this. And besides stats, you can just observe this plainly. Do any of these women look happy deep down, or are they just performatively coping? No one on their deathbed has ever said that they wish they had more career opportunities. No one. What dying people do lament is not spending more time with their family, but considering the trends of feminism, most of these women won't have one when their time is up. And it's not just women who are unhappy either. Men feel alienated and purposeless because the things men used to do are either condemned as toxic or have been taken over by women to the point where men are actively excluded. Feminism has always been destructive and has always pitted the sexes against each other, and that is because it is subversive and satanic. And you don't just have to take my word for it, because there are academic works like Satanic Feminism, Lucifer as the Liberator of Woman in 19th Century Culture by Per Faxneld, explaining this from the feminist perspective. The book explores how, according to the Bible, Eve was the first to heed Satan's advice to eat of the forbidden fruit. The notion of woman as the devil's accomplice is prominent throughout the history of Christianity and has been used to legitimize the subordination of wives and daughters. During the 19th century, rebellious females performed counter-readings of this misogynist tradition. Hereby, Lucifer was reconceptualized as a feminist liberator of womankind, and Eve became a heroine. In these reimaginings, Satan is an ally in the struggle against a patriarchy supported by God the Father and his male priests. The book delineates how such satanic feminism is expressed in a number of 19th century esoteric works, literary texts, autobiographies, pamphlets and journals, newspaper articles, paintings, sculptures, and even artifacts of consumer culture such as jewelry. And the 19th century was only the beginning. This was as true now as it was then. Listen to this feminist pastor explain to you how God was actually a liar and the serpent used Eve to bring about enlightenment and liberation for women.
People often ask me how I can be a feminist and a Christian. My response is that being a feminist Christian is the only way I can be a Christian. The author of 1 Timothy would certainly have considered feminist theologians and female clergy to be disobedient daughters of Eve. And there are a lot of Christians out there who would agree. And that's okay with me. Feminist theology has taught me how to reinterpret Scripture in ways that are healing and life-giving. Despite 2 millennia of misogynistic interpretations of Genesis and Eve, there have always been other ways to read this story. Have you ever noticed that God lied to Adam and Eve? While the serpent plays the role of the foil here, he's meant to set Eve up for her role as the bringer of wisdom and moral agency to the human community. The setup for this action that she takes is that God lied to her. When we say that we need to trust women to make the critically important decision about whether to continue a pregnancy, it is rooted in a reinterpreted understanding of the story of the Garden of Eden that recognizes and affirms the moral agency and wisdom that Eve chose in the garden for all of us.
We're often told to think of feminism in waves. Well-meaning conservatives will even rationalize the goals of early first-wave feminism, like women's suffrage, under the guise that, well, originally they were well-intentioned in the first wave, but it just, I don't know, got out of hand somehow during the second and third wave. But this whole wave thing, it's just a misnomer. It's all bad. But feminism advocates for women's rights after all. Don't you want women to have rights? Okay, well, women's rights to what exactly? Child murder, self-worship, and fornication? In that case, no, I don't actually. Suffrage and equality were always just the gateway. The real goal from the start has always been to completely subvert male authority. From Eve to Agrippina to Hillary Clinton, this has always been spiritual subterfuge. And their history proves this. The movement is venomous to the core, and its fangs are embedded in the very heart of our civilization. Consider Lady Macbeth, the quintessential domineering, power-hungry woman who prayed this unholy prayer. Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to toe top full of direst cruelty. Shakespeare understood, like anyone would in his time, that for a woman to manipulate and use her husband for gain would require not only embodying mannish qualities, but a fundamental, ritualistic spiritual rejection of the sex. Another poet, Richard Polwell, writes in his poem, The Unsexed Females, "Survey with me what ne'er our fathers saw, a female band despising nature's law, as proud defiance flashes from their arms, and vengeance smothers all their softer charms. I shudder at the new unpictured scene where unsexed woman vaunts the impetuous mean. As lordly domes inspire dramatic rage, court prurient fancy to the private stage, with bliss botanic as their bosoms heave, still pluck forbidden fruit with Mother Eve." By contrast, listen to how highly he praises proper women. Far other is the female-shapen mind, by modest luxury heightened and refined. Those limbs, that figure though by fashion graced, by beauty polished and adorned by taste. Polwell understood that the women who started this feminist revolution were actually working against the interest of women and also of men. The first of these feminists was an Englishwoman from the late 18th century named Mary Wollstonecraft. See Wollstonecraft, whom no decorum checks. Arise, the intrepid champion of her sex, or humbled man assert the sovereign claim, and slight the timid blush of virgin flame. Wollstonecraft was a writer and acquaintance of the Enlightenment thinker Thomas Paine. She's most known for piggybacking off of Paine's defenses of the disastrous French Revolution, as well as offering her own rebuttals to Edmund Burke, the father of modern conservatism, as he defended order, monarchy, and church in the wake of France's total cultural, civil, and spiritual upheaval. Her writings were, from the beginning, defending the death of Western civilization embodied in the blood of many French noblemen, priests, and nun. Her writings were not as widely read as Burke or Paine, often criticized as feminine, emotionally based reactions to Burke's masculine reason, but this was just the tip of the iceberg. And though she wrote that she, quote, did not wish to invert the order of things, that's exactly what she contributed to. The French Revolution, as we know, violently rebelled against the crown and the church as an unholy upheaval against order. So, of course, someone wanting to disrupt the order of men and women and the institution of marriage would advocate for such ideas. She understood, like many of the early feminists, that Christian values were incompatible with her own, and because they could not coexist, they needed to be removed. Marriage, God's holy matrimony mirroring Christ's love for the church, was one of the primary objects of her ire. She called it prison, comparing it to slavery. But, of course, this anti-marriage radicalism did not keep her from herself getting married when she got pregnant out of wedlock to a man named William Godwin, who was himself a quite infamous fellow in England for his own anti-marriage and free love ideas. Often considered the first modern anarchist, he took the ideas from the French Revolution and ran with them, worshiping rationalism and hating order. Together with Wollstonecraft, they had Mary Godwin, who was also a writer with atheistic radical tendencies, but comparatively more timid about them in her writing. You might know her for authoring Frankenstein, because Mary Godwin actually became Mary Shelley when she married the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, a rather nasty fellow who perpetuated this growing anti-Christian radicalism. It's fitting that he met his wife at the grave of her mother, and also that his love life was followed by a string of suicides. First by his ex-wife, whom he had left to be with Mary, and then Mary's sister-in-law, who lived with him, but also with whom he was having sexual relations before, of course, she killed herself. You might have thought that the early 1800s were squeaky clean, full of good Christian conviction. But here we already see people taking the Enlightenment secularism to its logical, godless conclusions, and this guy was as bad as it gets. Radical atheist, socialist, anti-marriage, sexually promiscuous, feminist, and a big fan of making Satan a sympathetic character in his writings. If it tells you anything, Marx was a big fan of the guy. Shelley's Satanism and the spiritual oddities that surrounded him and his ideas were certainly not unique to this time period. Secularism was beginning to take its toll. Eve was once again heeding the voice of the tempter. As feminism spread, anti-Christian ritual spread with it. In central New York, in a region called the Burned Over District, which was characterized by fiery religious fervor, is where the enemy chose to strike. The main Christian influence in the region was from the Quakers. However, the Quakers were quite distinct from really all of Christianity because they didn't believe in clergy and never practiced baptism, leading many to question how Christian they really were. Their doctrine, which was squishy, egalitarian, and full of post-Enlightenment ideas, proved fertile soil for further corruption. This primarily came in two forms: restorationist movements and spiritualist movements. Restorationism is the idea that the church is totally corrupted and we need to revert to or restore the original church. Many prominent restorationist movements popped up at this time in this region, like Mormonism or Millerism, which came to be known as Seventh-day Adventism under Ellen G. White, but most notably for our purposes, the Shaking Quakers, aka the Shakers. And of course, if you believe that the church is entirely corrupt, you can believe that anything the church has ever taught, like how women can't be priests, is up for reinterpretation. Although it began in England, Shakerism was brought to New York in the late 18th century by its founder, Anne Lee. They were called Shakers because of their ecstatic worship practices, which often involved chanting, dancing, and even vigorous convulsing. Remember that for later. But even though they're colloquially named after this practice, their core belief was much more blasphemous. Shaker was only the nickname. They actually self-identified as the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. But the only problem is that this second appearing, they believe, would be in the form of a woman, which they pinned on their founder, Anne Lee, whom they called Mother, as in Mother God. Not only does this fly in the face of everything written about Christ's second coming in Scripture, it perverts Christ's nature as a man, bringing in this weird subversive gender swapping. They also taught that sex was evil, and thus opposed God's design for marriage and the method by which it's consummated. Shouldn't it raise an eyebrow when the earliest feminists were anti-marriage, as well as these heretical groups that sprung out of Quaker gender equality? Maybe it's because you get the same looking fruit from any branch of the same tree. And a woman preacher called Mother Ann pretending to be trans Jesus was far from the only weird spiritual practice going on at this time. Consider Jemima Wilkinson, a woman who fell asleep with a fever in October of 1776 and woke up saying that she had died and was now the universal public friend, an androgynous, genderless preacher of love, tolerance, and, of course, women's rights. Definitely not demon-possessed, by the way, and definitely not the women engaged in the growing spiritualist movement who participated in mesmerism, or as we would call it, hypnotism, as well as seances, attempts to communicate with demonic spirit guides. This was often done by the help of mediums, also known as witches, serving as an unholy priesthood on behalf of these early feminists, because, surprise, the women who were doing all this weird demonic stuff were the same women attending these early women's rights conventions in the late 1840s and early 1850s. Take Seneca Falls, for example, which was also in this region of central New York, and if you look at the attendees, you see this huge overlap with erroneous religious doctrine like egalitarianism or Unitarianism, and literal demon conjuring through seances. And on the political side of things, you have Marx and Engels, who at the same time were popularizing this oppressor-oppressed dynamic by which to view the world, with Engels specifically labeling family and marriage as oppressive to women. And this is what everyone calls the supposedly mild-mannered first wave of feminism. Feminism has always been anti-Christian, always been about subverting men, always about destroying the distinction between the sexes, always been about free love, non-monogamy, and weird sex practices, and it has always been influenced by the demonic. They desire nothing short of total inversion and for men to submit to female authority, behavioral patterns, and sensibilities. And because men like Adam have done nothing to stop it, feminism is everywhere. Women got suffrage, and we've all suffered for it. Early feminism, late feminism, it's all been enabled by men. And with it comes further decay. And though like what we call second or third wave feminism really doesn't differ that much from first, there is a distinction to be made because contemporary feminism has something far more destructive propelling it culturally than it did at first. And that's the sexual revolution and the civil rights movement. Later 20th century feminists like Angela Davis, Kate Millett, or Gloria Steinem used the societal upheaval occurring during that time and incorporated those movements to propel feminism as well as the growing gay and trans agendas. Gloria Steinem herself declared that after Black Power, women's liberation. It's like there's a logical progression to these things. How all this overlaps and how all the multicultural intersectionality works could take up an entire other video, but basically it all has roots in upending order and Christian values. Once you have communism, upheaval, and chaos, you get women's liberation and the sexual revolution, and then the rest of the sexual deviancy we see in the West today. Everything we've talked about so far in this series was enabled by feminism, which was itself enabled by weak, passive men. It all goes back to Eve's deception and Adam's passivity. And why should we be surprised that this is the case? When you demonize masculinity, you're left only with certain female sensibilities which allow for decay to persist. Despite how liberated they consider themselves to be, women still have this innate motherly and supportive instinct. That instinct is great inside of a family, but it becomes a vulnerability to emotional manipulation when taken advantage of and applied outside of the family. The average man would never say, hey, let's go grab a beer with a woman who's pretending to be a man when she's like chopped her breasts off and has scraggly facial hair. But if a man tells a woman he wants to be one, the average woman will not hesitate to help him put on the charade, even though she knows but never will admit that he will never actually be a woman. All these gays and trannies on TV and social media are all cheered on by women. All these anti-marriage policies are being voted in by women. Women without men are taken advantage of and emotionally manipulated. Men are the arbiters of societal conduct, the enforcers of the law, not women. Women support people into becoming who they should be. But when you take that motherly role out of its context, when there's no man, for example, to say, hey, he's lying to you. He actually isn't born in the wrong body. He's a pervert. She's going to take the bait. And I know conservative women might say, well, I'm not that way. I see through the woke narrative. And that may be true in part, but like any modern woman, you probably have more internalized feminism than you realize. But also, the only reason that you see through the charade is because a man, likely a good father or husband who loves you, has shown you how to. Women without men in total isolation with one another will default to an unperceptive, frankly quite liberal MO, but within the context of proper authority under proper headship, those tendencies are curbed. And men without women tend to be less compassionate, selfish, and apathetic. That's why we need each other. I will reiterate that that context is most often, but not always, marriage, but there's always been an expectation that women with vocations to singleness would still be a part of a church family, mothering spiritual children under the authority of spiritual fathers and protected by spiritual brothers. This idea that women should be totally detached without any authority is totally foreign to history, and we're seeing how disastrous it is right now. Once you remove regulatory male authority, you get overbearing, irregular female authority, which further enables decay. And what better way to enforce this authority than to encourage men to give up theirs than to label true masculinity as toxic, conflating it with truly toxic, unmasculine behavior? Of course, there are plenty of men who misrepresent masculinity, but when you define masculinity by God's standards, you realize these kinds of men fall short. True masculinity, as God designed, is the only kind of masculinity. It cannot be toxic because it is inherently good. Anything else is an immoral caricature of masculinity or a total rejection of it. In the same way, true femininity, as God designed women, is the only kind of femininity, and it cannot be toxic because it is inherently good. There are those who misrepresent it or who reject it wholesale, but if they're not doing it God's way, they're not truly feminine. Both are defined by what is moral, what is proper. To be immoral or to not act as your given sex should is to water down or placate that role. Confusing those roles is one and the same with other immoral behaviors. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor sodomites, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners will inherit the kingdom of God. Homosexuals in some translations means effeminate, but either way, you're confusing male and female on some level, and that is an abomination to God, on any level, even if it's just the clothing. A woman shall not wear anything that pertains to a man, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all who do so are an abomination to the Lord your God, who, as we know, does not change. The more you confuse male and female by how you look or act, the more you stray from God. And the more masculine a man is, or feminine a woman is, as defined by God, the closer you are to him. There is no toxic masculinity. There is no toxic femininity. There's only what God has made, called very good, or there are the sinful, toxic confusions of the two. And the sooner we realize this, the sooner we can start presenting real scriptural solutions to a world slowly slipping down into the abyss, into the total disappearance of God and his created order, into no man's land. When leftists say that gender is a spectrum, they're not entirely wrong. Most people acknowledge that masculinity and femininity are not pure dichotomies. There are men who are more masculine and more feminine. There are women who are more feminine or more hoydenish. But viewed one-dimensionally, they miss two important factors. Though there are variations in how masculine men are or how feminine women are, there is a divide between the two that no one can cross. It is a dichotomy in that sense. The second thing they miss is that not all parts of the spectrum are equal. Without another dimension, everything is arbitrary. What they need, what we all need to correctly view masculinity and femininity, is the added dimension of virtue. Here we see two spectrums, each approaching positive and negative infinities on the outer extremities, with an uncrossable bottomless pit in the middle. On the left side, you have the spectrum of masculinity, and across it, the spectrum of femininity. All men and all women fall on these respective sides, with the men being more masculine along the one extremity and the women being more feminine along the opposite extremity, and either becoming more androgynous the closer they get toward the middle. Virtue is represented vertically. The higher along the y-axis one is, the godlier they are, living life abundantly by the full embrace of their God-given role as God has designed them. The lower one is, the more they are sucked down into confusion, immorality, and death. What is so confusing about most contemporary discussions of masculinity and femininity is the lack of this second dimension. These things are not subjective or arbitrary. What is godly and virtuous corresponds to someone living out the role God made for them. It isn't toxic for a man to be masculine. It's good and virtuous, and the less masculine he is also always less virtuous. Because masculinity and femininity are part of God's design prior to the fall, that are good and right and worth striving for, and for that reason they correspond to virtue. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, which I read at the beginning, where Paul talks about male headship, the chapter begins with this verse: imitate me as I imitate Christ. When we imitate Christ, these dynamics fall into place. When we misunderstand or ignore Christ completely, these dynamics fall apart. This is essential to understanding these conversations, and that's what's so confusing about this concept of toxic masculinity. Before expounding on this further, note that this is not relational. As the more masculine men are or the more feminine women are, that doesn't indicate distance between the two. That dynamic is best represented with a triangle, wherein the closer a man and woman are to God, the closer they grow to each other. The distance on the x-axis isn't estrangement, it's quite the opposite. The more two puzzle pieces become decidedly concave or convex, the better they fit together, as opposed to two flat tiles. The spectrums are representing that the more God-honoring a man or woman is, the more complementary they will be, and vice versa. Also note, the greatness does not equal virtue. There are men who are examples of great feats in history, but deprived of virtue, they are lesser men than those who aspire to serve God more than themselves. Let's look at some examples. Along these spectrums, we find 7 zones, 7 gradients of shades increasingly blended, each with a distinct masculine and feminine side. The topmost are the ideal men and women. They may not be perfect, as all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, but these examples embody their respective sex in highly respectable, archetypical ways worth emulating. This is where we might find Mary and Joseph, Ruth and Boaz, the apostles like Peter and Paul and King David. The latter few especially may have had notable character flaws, but their heart was always of God, and thus their behavior was, for the most part, exemplary of their respective role. But what about someone known for giving up that role? Slightly lower down, we might find Abraham and Sarah, and though they were faithful to God and instrumental to his plan, they have many qualities worth emulating, but they're also remembered for grave abuses regarding their respective roles. It was Abraham's cowardice that led him to give up his role as husband and protector, and Sarah's impatience about God's promise of a son that led her to domineeringly subvert both her husband and God's authority. which led, of course, to the birth of Ishmael, ancestor to many enemies of God's people. This brings us to the good zone, men and women who are not the very best examples, but still particularly good, living as distinct complementary men and women. These are likely people of your great-grandparents' generation, or even the bulk of Christian men and women historically. We still have some men and women in these zones, but it's becoming increasingly uncommon. Most people nowadays fall in the mediocre zone. These are the men who may be more of men because of the virtue found in following Christ, but are conditioned to hesitate to fully embrace their role because of the stigma that fully realized masculinity is toxic. These are your nice guys. Though they emulate Christ, their picture of Christ and his masculinity have been softened. The women, because these men are weakened, are compelled to take up the slack a little bit and are invited to be less of women as a result. And while there is a salvific distinction between those above and those below, there is sort of a gray commonality in the behavior of the Christian men and women whose roles are considerably weakened, and the non-Christian men and women who live somewhat virtuous lives but don't know Christ. People like Jordan Peterson, who at the time of recording this does not profess Christ as his Lord and Savior, but still lives by some moral code mostly congruent with Christian values. But because he does not know the love of Christ and emulate his sacrifice, he cannot be any more of a man. And don't get me wrong, God can and has used people all over these spectrums for his purposes, but that doesn't make them virtuous examples of masculinity or femininity. Above the equator, you have the Holy Spirit urging and convicting Christians upward to be more virtuous, but in the zone of mediocrity, we see the spectrums level out and start to descend into what is often called the slippery slope. Mere proximity to the slope means risking unraveling the roles and descending into no man's land. The next zone, just beyond the precipice of the slippery slope, are the maladjusted men and women. They often retain an outward appearance of their sex, but they use their sex exploitatively. They are unvirtuous, and by consequence, the men are more effeminate, as in dramatic, petty, and manipulative, and the women are more hoydenish, as in domineering and conniving. This is your typical attendee on a dating podcast, your Andrew Tates or your OnlyFans models. They are a charade of masculinity or femininity, and the only reason they retain that part of them is for the power in it. Their behavior can be called toxic, sure, but they are less masculine or less feminine for that. Relationally, they're characterized by their hatred for the other sex, yet also their desire to get something from the other sex. Remember how I said the horizontal distance represented complement, not relational nearness? Not only that, but it corresponds with the ratio of an individual's authentic love for the other sex to their lust for the opposite sex. The more complementary, the more men and women love each other for who they are. The more interchangeable, the more men and women actually hate one another deep down, but still desire them in an increasingly shallow and lustful way. True men and true women understand that they are different and deeply love one another for that. Fake men and fake women hate each other but cover it up with lust until you finally get to the ones who actually want to be one another, which, as we've discussed, is always rooted in sexual disorder. As we sink deeper, even the facades disappear and we get androgynous men and women. They are not only internally emulating qualities of the other sex, but these manifest externally as well. This is increasingly common among the hyper-online Gen Z, to the point where in many circles on TikTok and Reddit, some level of androgyny is like the societal norm. Just below this, we have the sexually deviant men and women who are not only disordered in their platonic relations between the sexes, but also in their inverted sexual relations, especially sodomy, where one participates in this inversion with their whole being. Finally, we have the most extreme examples of the transvestite men or women who seek to become the opposite sex, to cross the uncrossable divide. And the more they try, the deeper they go, the closer they are to slipping into death. This is the end result of egalitarianism, feminism, and removing masculinity from society. The wages of sin is death, and to declare that God's design is flawed is surely sin. That's why Satan himself belongs at the bottom. He often embodies a very androgynous, rebellious nature, with his ultimate end being to subvert God's plans and contort his designs. So this is how we ought to understand masculinity and femininity. Not as an arbitrary spectrum, but as two distinct natures, two distinct roles as God designed, with virtue corresponding to the fulfillment of those roles and life-draining immorality with the conflation of them. Masculinity cannot be toxic because to be masculine is to be moral according to how God made you. Femininity is the same way. An immoral man is less of a man, just as an immoral woman is less of a woman. Manhood isn't oppression, it's a gift. It's security, authority, and provision, not just monetarily, but spiritually. Womanhood likewise is not bondage, but a gift. It's beauty, nurture, and support. These balance and complement one another, but only if they are strictly defined as unique. When you confuse the two, you lose them both. That's why true masculinity is both decried as toxic and conflated with actually toxic, effeminate, immoral behavior. Our language has been hijacked to trick us into abhorring what we need most. And if you go along with this, if you play the toxic masculinity game, you're admitting that anything about God-created maleness is bad. You're contradicting God's declaration that masculinity is good, and you have taken the bait like so many others have. So many well-meaning men will start with, well, since some men act badly, I guess there is some kind of toxic masculinity as opposed to non-toxic masculinity. But that admission, that confusion is where everything begins to unravel. And practically, who cares? If you as a man are letting women and effeminate men define your masculinity, you have lost the plot. We are in no way morally obliged to blindly cooperate in our own destruction because of some flimsy modern social obligations. Why don't you be like a freaking decent human being? Why don't you emasculate yourself at the behest of women who hate you? Don't you understand? They are afraid of what we are capable of because they can't control us if we decide that their arbitrary, unnatural framework doesn't exist. The longhouse, the nanny state, it's a specter, a smokescreen. It only exists so long as you let it keep you on the leash. At some point, you're just going to have to accept that in the same way that men will never fully understand women, women will never fully understand you. And if you live your life appealing to their sensibilities, you will always fall short of your potential as a man. And honestly, the women in your life will resent you for it. Everyone knows that women say that they want things that they don't actually want and vice versa. And despite this innate feminine urge to tame the beast, so to speak, to domesticate the wild man, if you let that happen to you, you might as well be her dog or something because she will treat you the same way. By contrast, if you retain and grow in your masculinity, if you provide her with an adventure to be taken on, sometimes in spite of what she says that she wants, she will love you for it. But most men never achieve this because the matriarchy we live under requires boys to grow out of their male sensibilities as a barrier for entry to adulthood, which nowadays is more about becoming a grown child with reduced distinctions between the sexes than it is about actually flourishing into manhood or womanhood. But everything you loved in boyhood, the qualities that you saw in soldiers and knights and pirates and space rangers were all far more worth aspiring to than what the modern world, even the modern church, gives you the option for. Once we start to reclaim those inclinations, that every stick can be a sword, every wall or tree can be climbed, that every big rock or log must be lifted or thrown off a very high ledge, that one must become physically adept, mentally disciplined, and spiritually oriented, that there are risks to be taken, seas to be sailed, shanties to be sung, game to feast upon, bad guys to slay, princesses to save, and a sunset to be ridden off into. No matter how toxic or antiquated any feminist or castrated man thinks that is, we will be men unapologetically, because to do so is to the glory of God. The Lord is a warrior, the Lord is his name, and we are made in his image for the purpose of fighting a great battle. In our time, this battle is fighting the very notion that the masculinity we were designed for is bad. And not only that, but we must counteract the other lies that spring forth from that notion. Once you accept that masculinity and patriarchy in itself can be bad, you're primed to accept another one of these lies, that overarching feminine leadership, matriarchy, is good. I'm not talking about women leading other women or young children, because that's all well and good and quite necessary. What I am talking about is women leading in a systematic way over men as well as women in a political office or organization or in the church or in the home. They are subverting masculine headship. To say any part of masculinity is bad is to say that there is a deficiency in it of replacing or replenishing. And because men are the natural leaders of society, declaring masculinity the very reason they're inclined to lead to be bad is to say we need new leadership. And you can't just have no leadership, so removing the natural leader creates an unnatural power vacuum. Forfeiting male leadership necessitates that women and emasculated men who appeal to female sensibilities assume those roles. But this is always to society's detriment. When we tell women to try and do a man's job, we're setting everyone up for failure. Women are naturally disinclined to take leadership positions, so not only are they far from ideal leaders, but they also don't really want to either. At least when they're honest with themselves. But our society is hell-bent on telling them that they want to be a girl boss. But even the women who have taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker are doing so while coping with the fact that they long for something quite different.
Divorce became the norm. Women were forced to figure out how to do both the traditional male and traditional female roles, and we failed it. Studies show that the happiest demographic in the world is single, unmarried women.
Women are disinclined to take on leadership for a few reasons. First of all, female leadership is dysfunctional. It completely goes against feminine nature. Women naturally have a caring disposition. They're more emotionally vulnerable, and they have a much more volatile temperament, all of which is dictated by a hormonal makeup and a brain chemistry very, very different from men. Men have a 24-hour hormonal cycle and experience the same highs and lows consistently every day. Women, on the other hand, have a 28-day cycle and can go on a high or low for over a week at a time. That just doesn't provide the consistency needed to show up to work or a leadership position and face problems objectively and rationally. Not to mention that our brains function very differently. You may be familiar with the spaghetti waffle analogy, which portrays men's brains as neatly compartmentalized, whereas women's are a tangle of seemingly unconnected thoughts and ideas overlapping and commingling with one another. And if you don't think that's accurate, there was a video that went viral recently of a woman explaining this exact phenomenon, how she could never get anything done because it would always remind her of something else that she needed to do.
I'm overwhelmed.
Why?
Because I'm trying to clean the kitchen because it's a disaster. Cleaning, I realize I'm hungry, so I'm gonna make me some carrot juice. Well, start to make my carrot juice, but I can't make my carrot juice because I have no classes that are clean. Well, I'm gonna load these in the dishwasher, but when I go to unload the dishwasher, it's clean and full.
And every single woman that I know or that commented on the video heavily identified with it. And it's not a bad thing that we're different. That's just how God made women, and it probably somehow helps them be better mothers. But can we honestly say that we want brains which function like that to be our leaders? That sounds immensely counterproductive. And speaking of intelligence, there's a significant disparity in the rates at which men and women fall into each IQ category, whether that be below, at, or above average. Men fall more disproportionately in low average IQ categories, but also more frequently in above average IQ categories. Women, by contrast, fall most often in the middle. They are predisposed in the best case to groupthink, in the worst case to midwittery. Obviously, there are exceptions in either direction, but the vast majority of women, far more so than men, are going to exist in the middle and operate for their entire lives off of group consensus more than their own ideas. Again, not a bad thing. Because secular society has replaced moral virtue with intelligence, we may think that it's condemnation to say that the sexes are unequal in this way, but it's not. This is just how it is, and I think most people will recognize that it's dishonest to say otherwise. Some of the most happy and fulfilled women are the ones who don't involve themselves with overly intellectual matters and rely on their fathers or husbands to take care of those sort of things. But without a reliable man in their life, women default to going off the consensus of their immediate friend group, all of whom are more informed by social media algorithms and the news. And all their friends and all the women they see on social media, all the propaganda are telling them that men are evil, that they need to forsake the fulfillment of family for material gain, and that they should end their own bloodline. There are so many examples of women who were in happy relationships but were convinced by social media that they should cheat on their boyfriend or spouse, which leaves them alone with nothing but their own regret. All because of this consensus formed by women in positions of influence. The agreeableness and sociability of women is why they're far more likely to be swayed by the narratives popular to our time, like universal feminism or mask mandates or immigration or climate nonsense. All of these narratives are built off of emotional manipulation to which women are more vulnerable. Whether it's intelligence or lack of intelligence, rationality, individualism, or a number of other factors, men are more likely to see through those narratives. Just look at the correlation between education and taking the cope stab. Speaking of education, this is also why women are excelling far more than men in our current school system. To excel in said system requires compliance far more than intelligence. This is also why women are being pushed out of the home and into the corporate workforce and dissuaded from having children. Most of the prior drawbacks to hiring women have to do with their hormonal cycle or the time they take off to care for children. But if we convince you not to have kids or pay you to get an abortion if you do get pregnant, and also put you on synthetic birth control, which artificially regulates your hormonal cycle, then we'll have a nice, compliant, loyal worker who is just smart enough to do assigned tasks, but not enough to ask any tough questions. These kinds of women never grow out of high school because the society we live in provides them opportunities to remain in that state perpetually, doing the same menial task, coping with alcohol, and making sure they have the approval of teacher or boss, and making sure others follow the rules by coercion mechanisms like HR departments, which are also overwhelmingly dominated by women. Just look at the average IQ of college degrees by male to female male ratio. Despite a massive effort to push women into STEM jobs, women still gravitate towards positions like HR or therapy or marketing, jobs that require none of the objective rational thinking needed for STEM jobs and all the overbearing social control that comes with the other jobs. And speaking of overbearing, that's another hallmark of female leadership. I think men typically view their role more so in terms of what a leader should be rather than what they themselves are, but women, on the other hand, tend to be less concerned with what should be and far more with how they feel about what things should be. This is exactly what was illustrated by a study that Lego conducted a few years ago. Lego had tried for decades to tap into the female market, but had only ever consistently piqued the interest of young boys, for obvious reasons. So they conducted a study of thousands of boys and girls who were left in a room with a Lego Batman set, and they observed how they played with it. The boys would not simply play with Batman, they would become Batman. They would talk like Batman. They would put themselves in the mindset of Batman and emulate the actions of Batman. The girls, by contrast, would make Batman them. Batman would go shopping or go to the prom or whatever girly thing struck their fancy. They had to impose their sensibilities on the subject. This is why Barbie is the most popular girl's toy of all time. She's a blank slate. She can be whatever you want. And these patterns of behavior correlate exactly to the difference in fatherly and motherly authority. Men are made to be fathers. Their paternalistic assertion of authority is instruction-based and generally more hands-off unless discipline or teaching is needed. This is great for adults and older kids, but you can't treat young children like this. You can tell an older child, don't put your finger in the socket, you'll get electrocuted, but a younger child can't be instructed like that. You just have to take away any possibility that they would even touch the socket in the first place. That's where mothers come in. Maternalistic authority is prohibition-based. You don't tell a toddler not to poke around in the sockets, you just cover them up. It's low risk, but it's very controlling. Again, this is necessary for small children, but awful for older kids and adults, especially for men. In the worst case scenarios, this is exactly what happens when mothers perpetuate their son's childhood, allowing them to stay in the house, feeding them junk food perpetually while they sit in front of a computer and get fat all day. Or worse still, this is what happens when women decide that their son is going to be a girl now and needs to be mutilated so that she can get attention on social media. In all of these cases, I guarantee you that the father doesn't make the decisions because he's totally cucked, forced out of the picture, or absent entirely. This is why the public school system, which is dominated by female authority, is so bad for boys. Male behavior is more rambunctious, less risk averse, and the maternalistic nannying cannot account for what it cannot control because it does not understand it. What it does understand is the lowest common denominator of calm feminine sensibilities, which are then mandated, and boys are punished simply for being boys. And it's even worse now that boys are medically culled by putting them on mind-altering amphetamines for an attention deficiency disorder that doesn't actually exist. I was never a kid to get in trouble that often in school, but when I would get in trouble, it was always for the smallest semblance of rambunctiousness or violence. I remember the boys and I making guns out of Lego Duplo blocks, but the all-female staff did not like that one bit. The girls, on the other hand, never got in trouble because they would sit with the teachers and color and do arts and crafts. They were mild-mannered and compliant, and they were rewarded for it. The boys were just being boys and punished for it. Boys under female leadership are emasculated socially, spiritually, and even medically. When our institutions are run by women, our boys are trained to be girls. As I was writing the outline for this video, I was sitting at one of the many parks I like to write at, and the bench I was sitting at just so happened to be near a playground. And I kid you not, you're not going to believe this, but in a 30-minute span, I witnessed this play out exactly. When I got there, there was a father playing with his two daughters, and they were probably about 4 and 6 respectively. The kids were running around, no shoes on, without a care in the world, and definitely breaking most of the playground rules. And they were having fun. But did Dad take issue with this? Did he say, "Put your shoes on. Stop climbing on that"? Absolutely not. I watched as he stood by as his older daughter tried to climb up the slide with a scooter in her hand, which of course was not going that successfully, but instead of stopping her, instead of preventing her from any possibility of failure, he just said, "Good luck with that." He was letting her learn the lesson, knowing that she wasn't in immediate danger, but ready to be there if she did fail to pick her back up. Later, they were playing tag, and the youngest daughter was getting upset to the point of tears because she kept getting tagged. But did Dad change the rules of the game or give her an advantage? No, of course not. He told her to accept the rules of the game or she couldn't play at all. There's no crying in tag. He was both enforcing an expectation while encouraging her to meet that expectation through good moral character. This isn't rule following for its own sake, as with like closed-toed shoes only or don't climb up the slide. Rather, it's prudent understanding of why certain rules, like the particulars of a game of tag, are good and necessary. And it was obvious that they were all having fun together. That couldn't be said of the next kid I saw. After the dad and his daughters left, a couple showed up with their young boy. The dad was not very involved, occasionally more occupied with his phone than his kid, leaving mom to facilitate the play. And she was pretty much the opposite of playing tag or encouraging her kid to learn through exploration. She was hyper cautionary and overbearing. The kid was already wearing these big shoes, these wraparound glasses, and a big sun hat. Basically, he was insulated from the outside head to toe. Besides that, hey, he was an energetic little kid and all he wanted to do was play on the swing set in the sun. And I was rooting for him. But mom wasn't. Every time he would run over to the swing set and beg to be put in, the mom would deny and demand that he stay out of the dangerous sun. He already had a sun hat and a sun shirt on. Basically, any exposure was cut off already, but any exposure, even the littlest bit to the nourishing, energizing sun, was too dangerous. I watched this back and forth over and over as he would run to the swing set only to be dragged back into the shade until finally breaking down into tears, relenting to his mother's demands. It broke my heart. Not only because I felt bad for this kid, but because this is the reality for all boys and men under matriarchy. This is why we describe the kind of government we have now as the nanny state. We don't have kingly, masculine, paternalistic authority which sets just rules, bestows swift and precise justice on those who break the rules, but also gives the good people leeway to mind their own business for the most part. We instead have this overbearing mother state, which micromanages everyone, whose only conceived solution to problems is to henpeck people into submission by arbitrary restrictions. This is at the core of our issues with liberty in this country. We aren't free to live just and moral lives. We simply operate on this non-aggression principle, which ultimately stops justice from being served and allows injustice to proliferate. Our government doesn't expect people to be healthy and give them the resources to do so. It mandates diets which leave you fat and impotent and drugs you into being a zombie with SSRIs, birth control, or Adderall. Not to mention the other kind of pharmaceuticals they mandate to keep everyone safe and stop the spread. Our government doesn't uphold an expectation that people not hurt each other. It forbids them from protecting themselves and leaves the bad guys having all the power and the good guys left powerless. Our government doesn't end the lives of murderers or rapists. It just sticks them in a prison system where they sit around for years leeching off of taxpayer money so they can be set free to murder and rape all over again. And this is the same in the home too. Children used to be expected to deeply revere and obey their father and mother, and this was reinforced through proper, tangible punishment like spanking. But because of the appeal to female sensibilities, we, for the first time in history, conflate spanking, which is actually deeply loving, with abuse for some reason. That's been substituted with this abstract, gentle parenting whose only forms of discipline are intangible things like timeouts or even conversations that a child has no capacity for really internalizing, the same way that a quick and effective smack on the bum would do. And I think we've seen exactly what kind of men and women are produced from the timeout generation as opposed to the spanking generation. This is why Proverbs 13:24 tells us that he who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. The removal of masculine authority and its replacement with a feminized authority is the enabler of decay. Its inability to correctly perceive and identify threats and facilitate objective justice, not some vain sense of equality, will lead any society to ruin. And like anything dysfunctional, female leadership is also unproductive. Men are naturally inclined to lead, and women are naturally inclined to help because that's how God made us, but our society insists on telling women that they want something different. This tends to start as early as middle school and on into high school when young ladies are told that they need to pursue careers before a family, that we need more women in every field imaginable, and that they are somehow less than for choosing to start a family and devoting themselves to raising the next generation. I went to an all-boys college prep school, and we had an all-girls sister school that was also college prep that we would do co-ed events with. And I remember friends from that school telling me that they just wanted to be mothers, but the school, as they put it, wouldn't allow them to want that. If you ask a woman who stays at home what she does, in almost every case she will say, "Oh, I'm just a stay-at-home mom, as if somehow that's less valuable than a career instead of being actually the greatest, most beautiful thing she could be doing for her husband and children. And I don't blame women for using that language because that's what our society has led them to think subconsciously, but we need to do what we can to combat that thinking as much as possible. Women don't naturally seek male positions unless they're told to, or if male abdication compels them to. And that's not at all to say that women can't lead other women or that women can't work at all. Women should absolutely lead other women, as Paul instructs in Titus 2. The older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. Women teaching other women to be chaste, homemakers, and obedient to their husbands is edifying to the church. Women forsaking these duties, especially going so far as to teach men, is the opposite. And that's not to say that women can never work outside the home, but it all must be in service of the home and the family, never at the expense of it. That's doable. It's not easy, but you have to have your priorities straight. When you realize what full optimal service to the home looks like, the kind of lives your great-grandmothers likely lived, you realize that that's very difficult, and especially to have a full or even part-time career as well as being a homemaker without the homemaking becoming mediocre by comparison. When women choose a career which requires this mannish ladder climbing and years of uninterrupted devotion, she is required to give up part of her femininity, and the family, or potential for family, suffers. When a woman takes on a laborious job, she's taking on Adam's curse as well as Eve's curse, heaping strife upon herself and neglecting the home. Any woman who has figured this out will tell you that they were incapable of fully embracing their femininity while trying to pursue masculine productivity standards that society pressures upon them to pursue in this vain attempt to prove that men and women are the same. We're not. And when women realize this, they will tell you that even if it means sacrificing income, it's always worth it to fully embrace that role and let go of this feminist idea of getting women into every field and career necessary. We need less women in most fields, actually, and more women embracing their role as homemakers. Most industries have suffered because of this push to include women. And I can tell you without a doubt that men work more collaboratively, efficiently, and enjoyably with each other when it's just men. I'm not saying women can only do homemaking. They can be artists or writers or caretakers or teachers, but the home must be prioritized. Because without prioritizing it, we've seen how it's suffered. These intensive corporate careers require outsourcing. The less you can do for your family yourself, the more people who are less invested in your family's well-being will have to meet those needs. Children are needy, and if you don't meet those needs, someone else will. What you can't cook and feed for them yourself, you're going to have to get from someone else, and it's probably going to be much worse for them by comparison. Same thing goes for clothing or healthcare or education or whatever you're providing for your children. Unless they could afford servants or private tutors, the women of the past used to do many of these things themselves, or at least share these responsibilities with the community, which was often centered around a church, and they were remarkable for that. The modern standards are basically on the floor. Even for young women to aspire to be half the woman their great-grandmother was is asking a lot. But it's far from impossible so long as women decide that actually they don't want to be subpar men slaving away for a boss or pretending to be some kind of leader to the detriment of men, and instead they want to be an excellent woman in full devotion to the home or the church. Now, when you bring up female leadership, people always like to bring up examples like Deborah, or actually I can't think of any comparable examples, maybe Esther, but I will address them nonetheless. In the rare examples of women in leadership positions in the Bible, none of them are in sole authoritative active positions. There are no godly examples of women being king or priest. Those words even need female counterparts like queen or priestess because the words themselves are inherently male. And the only priestesses in the Bible are pagan ones. But what about prophetesses, you may ask? Those are in the Bible and they're God ordained. Well, that's true, but what is prophecy? Prophecy is a passive relaying of God's word. A prophet or prophetess is a messenger, not a legislator. In the case of Deborah, not only did she live in a time of extraordinary apostasy, but she was also not charged in leading Israel in battle, as was the responsibility of every other judge before and after her. That was Barak's job, and even he was shamed for his cowardice for not taking up that mantle without Deborah's accompaniment. And it's not the only place the Bible considers it to be a curse to be ruled over by women. Woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for the reward of his hands shall be given to him. As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, Those who lead you cause you to err, destroying the way of your paths. Don't get me wrong here, God can and has used women in extraordinary ways, but it's never as independent leaders of men. There are no female equivalents to Boaz or Joshua or Gideon or David or Josiah or Paul or John. In the same way, there are no male equivalents to Jael or Esther or Ruth, because they were uniquely feminine and used by God within those parameters. God does not deny nor contradict himself, and he does not change. So when he says that he made male and female, and it was very good that way, and specifically said that women should not be taking men's roles like leadership and teaching, we should try to take that to heart and stop trying to circumvent him. I really don't know how people square interpreting that any other way, but when it's your word versus God's word, I'm going with God's word every day in the week and twice on Sundays. And not to mention, there's an 1800-year precedent in the church of not allowing women to be ordained to ministry. And when we see this accretion coinciding with feminism, which, as we've discussed, is like obviously satanic, the alarm bell should start going off. These parameters do not deny the influence women can have, rather they provide guidelines by which they can be most effective and least likely to err. Central to love is knowing something as it really is. And if we love women, we must acknowledge and account for their nature. Just as becoming a slave to Christ brings liberty in life, conforming to God's distinct, unique, and complementary design for our respective sexes brings an abundance of life that cannot be found otherwise. And this idea that we aren't made to complement, to depend on each other, is the last big lie. Egalitarianism in a broad sense is totally foreign to any mind prior to the Enlightenment, and in a theological sense, only as recent as feminism. It completely and totally contradicts God for a few reasons. Firstly, it implies that men and women are somehow interchangeable. And if men and women are interchangeable, God was somehow wrong in designing them differently and wrong in purposing them differently. This is why feminism is so deeply anti-Christian. Its core is rebellion to God's order. But tragically, it has taken such deep root in the church. In many cases, it was even affecting the church before the rest of society. Before women's suffrage, there were women masquerading as pastors. The church's male leadership was too weak to stand up for God's order, ignoring his design to please a few unruly congregants, and from that weakness, society changed irreparably. Well, almost irreparably. It was men's abdication of authority that led to these problems in the first place, but they can be undone if, or rather when, men will to take authority again. The world was and always will be patriarchal or androcentric because it is centered around the man, Jesus Christ. God is perfectly masculine. Jesus could only come to the world incarnate as a man. Only the bridegroom could redeem the bride. Man is the image and glory of God, but woman is the image and glory of man, and men are called to imitate Christ specifically in his love for the church. Not that women are called to imitate Christ, but it's in a different way. He is the leader, she is the helper, and each man should have the opportunity. Not every man is capable of leading other men, but in the home, he should have the opportunity to be the priest and leader. But if he becomes passive and the wife starts wearing the pants because somebody has to, he is thus deprived of leadership and weakened in purpose. Male power is God ordained, therefore self-perpetuating, only undone by abdication. This is true of the church just as it is in the home and the nation. Men and men alone should be the priests and overall leaders. Only pagans had priestesses because to have them is rebellion to God. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission, which is not to say without participation, but non-disruptively. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she shall be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. Again, the reasoning is not simply cultural, but pertaining to our respective natures. Paul brings up Eve's deception because women are more easily spiritually deceived, and you have to account for that. He's giving universal reasons for unilateral teaching. The early feminists were into seances, the early woman preachers were Unitarians or transvestites or blasphemers, and nowadays you can't throw a rock without hitting a Western woman practicing yoga, tarot, Wiccan, or some other gateway to the demonic. This is primarily the work of the demonic principality, Baal, who is the possessor. He has taken and possessed what God has designed so that it may be inverted. He has also influenced women to possess what was not made for them, and thus we have chaos and decay. And who in scripture is associated with chaos and decay and is also known for manipulatively possessing her husband's authority? Jezebel. When you have women assuming roles of authoritative leadership over men, whether civil or spiritual, as exemplified by Jezebel, something is bound to go wrong. Jezebel was the wife of King Ahab and a devoted servant of Baal. She would do whatever it took, including manipulating her own husband and stealing his authority to kill the servants of God. And though Baal was incapable of sending down fire like God, he was still at work through Jezebel and her ilk. Baal, the demonic principality, is the possessor, and just as he worked through Jezebel, he works now in our secularized society to take what is God's and possess it for Satan. Then his wife Ashtoreth transforms things until Moloch can destroy them utterly. Decay begins with claiming dominion over what is God's. And you know what was possessed first? The churches. We already talked about the weird spiritual occurrences that coincided with the early feminists, but this is also where the phenomenon of female pastors began. The first of these is considered to be Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who spoke at the first National Women's Rights Convention in 1850 and was licensed to preach at Congregationalist Church only a year later. But of course, she didn't give up her feminist activism after gaining access to the pulpit. Rather, she used that platform to preach her feminist ideology. Eventually, she continued to compromise her doctrine and eventually became a Unitarian, a belief system shared by many of her compatriots like Lucretia Mott, another woman minister and feminist activist. Unitarianism is the belief that all people go to heaven, which is a fundamentally anti-gospel doctrine, but really it shouldn't be surprising. Once you decide that you can reinterpret the parts of scripture that say the qualifications for being a pastor are explicitly be a man, not a woman, what stops you from reinterpreting the verses on head covering, submission, sexual ethics, down to salvation and the gospel? The answer is nothing is stopping you. And those doctrines, like only having male teachers, head coverings, submission, and forbidding contraception, were all universal in both Catholic and Protestant churches prior to feminism. As soon as you stop believing that the Bible is all true, you're free to pick and choose what's true or whether or not any of it's true. It's like subverting male headship is subverting God's authority. It happened then, and it's happening now. Feminism was rotten at the root, and so is its fruit. We go on scratching our heads as to why men are disappearing from the church or even society altogether, but it becomes very clear when you trace the effeminacy of the modern church straight back to the start of ordaining women. Along with Antoinette Brown Blackwell and Lucretia Mott, Phoebe Palmer became a preacher at a Methodist church in New York around the same time and co-founded the Holiness Movement. Now, you might not know the Holiness Movement at all that well or its impact on the modern church, but you likely know Pentecostalism, which grew out of the Holiness Movement thanks to a woman named Lucy Farrow. The niece of Frederick Douglass, Lucy was a pastor at a Holiness church in Texas in 1905, where she was introduced to a man named William J. Seymour, a pastor from LA. Seymour invited Farrow out to LA to attend what ended up being known as the Azusa Street Revival. This revival is considered to be the catalyst for the spread of Pentecostalism. Spanning several days, congregants met to worship in this LA building, but the worship became something very unlike typical ordered church worship. Observers both inside and out describe it as full of shaking, speaking gibberish, and howling even throughout the night. Remember the Shakers who came about over 100 years prior under the leadership of Mother Ann Lee? They have the shaking in common for sure, but that is a symptom of the root cause. A lack of order and a disregard for scripture that leads to unorthodox spiritual practices and doctrinal error, like allowing woman preachers. From the growing Pentecostal movement, we get a woman named Amy Semple McPherson, who went on to form the Foursquare Church. She traveled around the country holding revival meetings as well as appearing frequently on the radio. But although her preaching career was quite popular, it was also wrought with controversies like an alleged fake kidnapping, a number of affairs, and a couple of divorces. The first of these divorces was initiated by her husband, Harold McPherson, who grew to increasingly dislike their unstable, unsettled lifestyle. And I don't blame him. Most people find out way too late that the non-traditional ways of living brought about by feminism are actually really unfulfilling. Out of the Foursquare Church came Calvary Chapel and the Jesus movement in what is often considered the second wave of the charismatic movement. And I'm not saying that their doctrine is perfect. I mean, personally, I take some issues with their theology, but they are notable for the purposes of this video as like a step back towards orthodoxy because they disallow women to preach and condemn the manic behavior of some of the more radical Pentecostal denominations. And also note that I'm not condemning these denominations outright. There are still plenty of churches under the Pentecostal and charismatic umbrella that affirm the essentials of the faith, but there are also ones who don't, like the Oneness Pentecostals, who don't even believe in the Trinity. I'm not saying they're all the same, but what I am saying is that there's a clear trajectory from the ordination of women to the modern, highly effeminate churches, and often concerningly erroneous churches that we see today, especially in the third wave or neo-charismatic movement. Heavily influenced by Amy Semple McPherson, neo-charismatic churches can be Pentecostal but are more popular with the growing non-denominational church movement. Most common among these churches is a lack of any sense of tradition, a focus on visual spectacle, a casual, often anti-formal attitude, and most remarkably, emotionally based, feminized worship and preaching. And it's not even limited to these churches because they have a massive influence on the direction of church culture, far more on the traditional churches than the traditional churches have on them. And before the Catholics hit me with, sounds like the consequences of Protestantism to me, you're not immune to this either. Just like the certain heretical offshoots of Protestantism that we've discussed, there are also cases of heretical offshoots of Catholicism that hold these heterodox beliefs because a woman decided that all of a sudden she had new spiritual revelation that redefines and ultimately lessens who Christ is. And again, I'm not saying all Catholics believe these things. I know that they don't. It's a minority. But I'm just saying this to point out that these principalities and their agenda are trying to subvert the church in more than one place. Catholics may not have doctrinal changes as egregious as like mainline Protestantism or neo-charismatic churches, but that doesn't mean that the spirit of feminism of worshiping the woman has not taken root. Even besides the doctrine, this can be practically observed with how many women run parishes, not in an ordained role, but functionally behind the scene.
Most churches have been run by women for the past several decades. Okay, maybe not in an official capacity, or as pastors or priests in all these cases, but women have been running the show in most churches for a long time. Anyone who's been going to church for any period of time knows that. I mean, even in the Catholic Church, where women cannot become priests, still, your average Catholic parish, not going to have a female priest, but there will be, in almost every case, a gaggle of women who basically run things. And that is why, for years now, most churches have catered to women because they've effectively been run by women. Churches in America are already female-led, okay, much to their detriment.
Sadly, this is the case for many churches, whether Novus Ordo or non-denominational. The worship especially is simplified, often centered on the self and one's own feelings instead of the corporate congregation singing to and about God. This is especially troublesome when you transfer the identity of the congregation being the bride of Christ to the individual. So not only is it feminine to sing the simplified Jesus is my boyfriend music, you got the male half of the population of the church assuming a feminine voice, which is really weird. It's spiritually gay.
Daddy, please fill me. That's you. I want you to pray. Let's pray it out loud. Let's not be scared. Let's pray it out loud. Daddy, please fill me. Don't let me miss you. I want you.
Not to mention that these churches who are becoming culturally feminine are rife with female pastors, undoubtedly reinforcing the expectation to appeal to female sensibilities. And I think this trend is also especially indicative of the decline of platonic male intimacy that comes as a result of toxifying and banishing real masculinity. Part of that simply comes from the reality that women do not fully understand male fraternity unless they are taught to appreciate it. They kind of just revile it. So when men grow up, as many do nowadays, without authentic male friendship, how are they supposed to conceptualize the friendship we find in Jesus, considering our society only ever portrays male fraternity as shallow or like secretly erotic? When you put men in an environment such as church, which was traditionally led by other men, where you came to confess your sins, contemplate the immensity of God's goodness, and sing songs about being a warrior for the cross, and you replace it with free coffee, smoke machines, woman pastors, and an atmosphere which, whether consciously or not, kind of doesn't like it when men are men, it's no wonder men aren't going to church. Not only that, but then you add the chaotic practices of a lot of these churches, the shaking and the shouting, and you're not only alienating men, but you're also running the risk of serious spiritual infiltration. As 1 Corinthians 14:33 tells us, "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints." And I don't think it's exactly coincidental that the very next verse reminds us to let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. It makes a lot of sense that in these churches where women are on the opposite end of the spectrum from silence, going so far as to teaching, you get the opposite of the peace and clarity Paul describes in the verse prior. Chaos and disorder are not from God, just as this idea that men and women are interchangeable is not from God. Again, once you reinterpret what God says about the roles of men and women, you're free to reinterpret whatever else you want. And in the worst cases, this means incorporating entirely unchristian spiritual practices. The worst case nowadays is probably Bill Johnson's Bethel megachurch, which is notorious for their female pastors' erroneous spiritual practices, effeminate worship music, and even their own Bible paraphrase, the Passion Translation, the author of which believes the Spirit of God is feminine.
And the bride is his favorite. We are a feminine in his eyes. We are feminine. By the way, did you know the Holy Spirit in both Greek and Hebrew is always feminine? Yeah. But nobody would want to talk to her that way. I don't know why we don't talk to her. I think we've got issue or two, but that's all right.
Why is there such a concerted effort to make God a woman? On top of all of this, Bethel also practices, by their own admission, the adoption and retrieval of New Age practices. It's no secret, Bill Johnson literally wrote a book on it. Remember the Shakers and the Azusa Street Revival? And now the neo-charismatics who writhe uncontrollably and shout and speak gibberish?
Joy all over this house, Lord. More joy, Lord. We can't get enough joy, Lord Jesus. Tickle them, Lord. Let the tickle angels come. Lord. Yes, more joy, more praise, more thanksgiving, Lord. Just more praise, more thanksgiving, Lord.
Well, they're not the only ones that do that. There's an aspect of the New Age, specifically of yoga, called Kundalini, which believes that the core of one's life force is stored around the pelvis, which when properly stimulated coils up the spine like a snake, causing uncontrollable shaking. The similarities can't be purely coincidental. It's also not coincidental that as seances and mediums were nearly ubiquitous with the early feminists, even in the church, yoga and the New Age are likewise ubiquitous among contemporary feminists, even inside the church.
Yes. Mary Magdalene actually had her Kundalini awakening before Jesus did. She was Jesus's divine union, the divine feminine, the divine masculine coming together, and the divine feminine leads spiritually. Therefore, she achieved Christ consciousness before Jesus, and the divine masculine then follows soon after. If it wasn't for Mary Magdalene, who knows where Jesus would have been? The Bible depicts Mary Magdalene as a prostitute, and she is made out to be sinful. The snake, the serpent, right, is often depicted as sinful and evil and temptation, when in reality the Kundalini is the serpent, and it is sensual and it is divine, but it is not evil. It is powerful, and Mary Magdalene was one powerful woman.
Despite the consensus that yoga is totally harmless, everyone outside the Western world understands it to be a spiritual discipline. India's own government says so, and so will any Christian from India who wouldn't dare touch it with a 10-foot pole. Yoga is this false liturgy, this false cycle with real, dangerous consequences. It promises unity with the universe and the Hindu gods, which, as we know, are demons. It's so characteristic of our time to take something that's objectively, well, objectionable and filter it through the subjective lens that says, I can practice yoga and Christianity because I have decided that they are compatible. What you decide about spirituality doesn't matter, especially considering that the heart is deceitful above all things. Our job is not to will our spirituality because we are incapable of doing so. There is no manifesting or deconstructing, there is just the way things are. Our job is to submit to God's ways as they are, or else be swallowed by Satan. God does not tolerate or coexist with darkness, and the darkness is happy to repel the light in kind. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake in the Lord's table and of the table of demons. And the sooner we become set apart from seances or yoga or Kundalini or mediums or Wiccan, hyper-individualism, feminism, and all this demonic chaos, the sooner we can let God restore order, justice, and family in our repentance. We need men to retake their place as the protectors of women and children because, as Paul reminds us, it was Eve that was deceived, not Adam. He was sinful too, but his sin was failing to protect his wife, who, like all women, are more susceptible to spiritual deception and emotional manipulation than men are. Call me what you want for saying that, but it's true. And the sooner we act like it, the sooner we can start protecting women, even if that means protecting them from what they think that they want. It's not worth letting a bunch of Jezebels run around and reaping the consequences now, is it? None of the aforementioned issues we've discussed, homosexuality, transgenderism, and the like, would have proliferated in a society led by authentically masculine, virtuous men. But our men are so weakened that even in their own homes, they're being usurped by women who are inundated with propaganda telling them to hate their role and the oppressive men that put them in it. It's no wonder so many men feel aimless and helpless. Their leadership roles are being taken from them everywhere they go. And what must be understood about leadership is that it calls you and requires you to be greater than yourself. It is a burden and a responsibility, not prideful vainglory. It's a call to self-sacrifice through the assertion of your will and authority in alignment with God. It's a virtue called magnanimity. Despite it being, as Thomas Aquinas described, the crown jewel of all virtues, we hardly ever speak of it now. Magnanimity is greatness of the soul, characterized by a desire to strive for greatness. This quality is at the core of manhood, and it is chiefly what has been lost by feminism declaring masculinity toxic. And a lot of the church has helped out this feminist cause by conflating magnanimity with pride and toxic masculinity. But as C.S. Lewis points out in The Abolition of Man, the disappearance of greatness and the desire to do great things has left us with men without chests. He identifies the chest, the mediator between man's spirit and base desires, as the seat of magnanimity. But modernism, subjectivity, and destruction of universal traditional values has created these men without chests, weak, pacified, and effeminate. As the king governs by his executive, so reason in a man must rule the mere appetites by means of the spirited element. The head rules the belly through the chest, the seat, as Alanus tells us, of magnanimity, of emotions organized by trained habit into stable sentiments. The chest, magnanimity, sentiment, these are all the indispensable liaison officers between cerebral man and visceral man. It may even be said that it is by this middle element that man is man, for by his intellect he is mere spirit, and by his appetite mere animal. The operation of teaching relativist values is to produce what may be called men without chest. And all the time, such is the tragic comedy of our situation. We continue to clamor for these very qualities we are rendering impossible. You can hardly open a periodical without coming across the sentiments that what our civilization needs is more drive, or dynamism, or self-sacrifice, or creativity. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. This is what we get by insisting that masculinity can be in and of itself toxic. Men without chests.
I thought that marriage should just be between a man and a woman. But your generation has changed my mind.
If we have any desire to fix the problems that plague our civilization, we can only hope to do so by restoring order between the sexes. Women need masculine men to lead and protect them, and men need feminine women to inspire and help them. Feminism is anti-woman, and therefore it is anti-man. Our success is not at the expense of one another, it is dependent on the well-being of one another. Feminism leads to the toleration of vice, the diluting of virtue, the removal of men, and the absence of God on a societal level. And because of this, we've strayed so far from God's word, and even from our own historical memory, to remember the truth. We've forgotten our nature. We've forgotten who men and women are, and we've forgotten how sorely we need each other as God designed us. Men aren't supposed to be weak, but strong and courageous, yet meek, reserving true strength for only when it is necessary. Not controlling, but authoritative, yet gracious. Not blindly tolerating, but loving, even if it's not what people want to hear. Not acquisitional, but sacrificial. Not seeking comfort, but embracing difficulty. Not keeping peace where action is needed, but making peace where strife abounds. Not passive and unassertive, yet gentle with women and children. Not inconsistent, but fiercely loyal. Not animalistic or brutish, yet undomesticated. A warrior poet, a noble savage, wild at heart, disciplined in mind, guided, chastened, and stalwart by the virtue of magnanimity, strengthened not by the self, imposing a will not of one's own machinations, but strengthened by God's righteous hand on behalf of his will, and loving like Christ loved the church, not in submission to the wife, but in headship, bound as one flesh, serving the Father. And women, though the weaker vessel, are by no means incapable or of less value. She's not showy but graceful, not self-deprecating but humble, not flagrant but confident in who she is as defined by God alone, not domineering instead soothing, not lacking boldness yet careful, not a doormat but submissive to a husband or a father whether familial or spiritual, not a servant of a boss man but of a loving family who call her blessed, not robotic but obedient and chaste, encouraging other women to follow suit, whose beauty is radiant, whose love is tender, whose devotion is unshakable. How sorely we need these women and men of virtue. How sorely they need each other. Realized masculinity enables the embrace of femininity, but a lack of masculinity creates a destructive, chaotic vacuum. Masculine men create feminine women. Effeminacy creates unvirtuous, immoral, hoydenish women. And nobody wants that. Masculinity is not toxic. It is a gift. Its provision is not simply monetary, it is spiritual. Its stability and order and righteousness, and even though man in his sin falls short of this, it is Christ's masculinity that embodies this perfectly. It is he that we emulate, and such emulation should never be called toxic, even if it means calling people to repentance, overturning money tables, calling evil like it is, and fighting for what is right. We need strong masculine men now, more than ever. But where did the masculine men go? Why and when did this stop being the societal norm? If we are to become strong men, we need to get rid of the environmental factors holding us back, influencing us for the worse. It's been said that hard times create strong men. That strong men create good times, that good times create weak men who then in turn create hard times over and over again. But why? Why do good times create weak men? Are the noble goals of generations past, the prosperities and liberties they bled and died for, really just ensuring the downfall of their posterity? It might be easy to infer on the surface that this cycle confirms that material gain and ease of living automatically produces weakness. Good times means that you don't have to work as hard, so men become soft, right? Well, not necessarily. You may think that, as they say, money is the root of all evil. But what scripture actually said was that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. You see, when it comes to behavioral patterns, individually or generationally, you cannot rely solely on the material to inform your understanding. You have to understand the spiritual. The mere possession of money is not a matter of morality, but the love of money is a matter of priority and value, or a lack thereof. It's easy to look at our decadent society and see a rampant lack of morality. But no solution can come from surface level observation. We have to understand the root. When diagnosing the decline of our civilization, when asking why have our men become so weak, we must understand that, as we discussed prior, the true measure of strength and weakness corresponds to virtue and its absence. It isn't liberty and prosperity that makes men weak, not by itself. It's the erosion of the values that call us to strength. Universal, transcendent values supersede man's own reasoning and limited, misguided knowledge. When you remove them, we are left to our own self-destructive devices. We were led to believe that replacing God with pure reason would usher in utopia with total equality. We could graduate out from under the tutelage of superstitious religion and instead coronate ourselves as our own rational rulers. But instead of unifying utopia, the very cohesion of our society and its ability to recognize and exact justice began to dissolve. The physical and spiritual were bifurcated, metaphysical awareness evaporated, time and space shattered, with an open invitation for hearts to be corrupted and souls to be forfeit. It is not merely prosperity which creates soft men, but prosperity more potently tempts men to fall back into our sinful ways. For men, this is always characterized by a selfish abdication of responsibility. In every man's life, there are burdens that he is expected to take up that he alone can take up properly. Men are called to adversity because we are uniquely equipped to overcome it as God created us. Yet, by our sin nature, we are prone to avoid it or try to circumvent it altogether. In the garden, it was man's responsibility to protect and steward God's creation and to uphold God's commands. Yet, when the time came for him to step up, when the serpent hissed temptations into the woman's ear, when she reached out for the forbidden fruit, ate of it, and handed some of it to her husband, he did nothing. every step of the way. By his sinful disobedience to God, characterized by this abdication of responsibility, he was separated from God and cursed to toil in difficulty, to wrestle with the world and the woman he once had unquestioned dominion over. But ever since, especially in times of prosperity, man has been trying to cheat this curse. The only solution to sin is to submit and to obey and to put our trust in God. But the heart of man is instead set on trying to glorify and save himself. The man without God, without virtue, lives to cheat his curse, to unnaturally prolong life and vainly enrich it with fleeting decadence, which is always at the expense of others. He believes that he can do better than God. The forbidden fruit was eaten under the very pretense that Adam and Eve would become like God. But even though man tries to make another way, he always finds himself woefully incapable. And this is where everything falls apart. Replacing the transcendent with man's mind, which is incapable of even beginning to comprehend the world properly, removes any sense of constancy and dissolves all meaning. When eternity is minimized, temporality is magnified. When one does not live for the future, one only lives for the present. Life becomes defined solely by a pursuit of self-elevation and instant gratification. Good times create weak men, not simply by circumstance, but because more prosperous men tend to forget, forsake, and take for granted the values which guided their strong forefathers. The virtuous man is self-denying and self-sacrificial regardless of circumstance. But when those virtues are forsaken, they are always traded in for vices. Selflessness is replaced with selfishness, the absolute with confusion, wisdom with foolishness, and the solid rock with sinking sand. A world without God, without transcendent virtue, is destined to devolve into decadent hedonism. And what is the peak of this hedonism if not materialism? In order to circumvent our curse to labor, we try to minimize work as much as possible. Instead of the spiritual, we pursue the material and its physical pleasures. We are no longer serving God by stewardship and diligence, we are worshiping man-made idols of self and substance. But this is never satisfying. Not only does the material always leave us hungering for more, the refutation of our responsibility always brings unintended consequences. In our current day, the new godless paradigm and its disastrous consequences are all derivative of the secularism born out of the Enlightenment and the materialism born out of the Industrial Revolution. Whether it's the roles and relationships between men and women, or the family unit, or the value of hard work and stewardship, down to the food we eat, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the ground upon which we tread, all of it has been corrupted on an almost universal scale. The idols we erected may have only been inanimate symbols. But just as the ancient pagans, something sinister was working behind what we can only see in the physical. Materialism may be the physical manifestation, but secularism is the spiritual impetus. Ironically, that secularism disconnects us from being able to see the spiritual, which is the driving force of the corruption we see in the physical. Secularism says that we can create society outside of God. Without religion, we'd have paradise, utopia, living in atheistic liberal democracy where anything goes because the best ideas win out in the end. Because we're just so good-hearted deep down, aren't we? Yeah, when has that ever been true in history? When has secularism ever succeeded? It will never work because it is impossible to create a society outside of God, because there is nothing outside of God. Man is entirely dependent on God. The fact that we have breath in our lungs, or blood in our veins, or even that the universe is ordered and the least bit intelligible to our minds is all taken for granted. We know deep down that there is something above everything else holding it all together, and we know that we are made to worship that thing. Failing to properly acknowledge that God is that thing is an elevation of the self to that level, a role which we are disastrously incapable of filling. That's why atheism doesn't actually exist. Man elevates mankind, science, and reason to his own personal godhood, only to find that it's always insufficient. You can't fill the vacant role of the transcendent with something that cannot transcend man, just as a two-dimensional being cannot conceptualize the third dimension in only 2 dimensions. So despite secularism touting a removal of religion, it's really just the replacement of a true religion with a false one. Secular society doesn't bring us to a slight divergence of the truth, as it seems to be at first, but in a long enough timeline, it reveals itself to be in diametric opposition to the truth. Through the removal of God, we've opened the door to be driven by God's enemies. All the destruction we currently see in the physical is a counterpart to the spiritual war waged against God, and the family in the church has been caught in the crossfire. If the godly family in the church is central to a strong society, they would have to be destroyed. And to destroy the family in the church, you would need to destroy the men tasked with defending them. But this will never work by open warfare because the enemy has no power against what God has ordained. The only thing the enemy can do is make man defect. He can only tempt man to let down his guard and allow the enemy to sneak in. To defeat the family and the church, you make men defective, persuading them to turn their back on God. That doesn't always mean becoming an atheist. Satan is too clever for that. The most heinous way he goes about this is by making men weak and ineffective in their job as spiritual leader and protector in the home. Those men may still profess Christ, but they become lazy and allowed a massive blind spot to develop. And when man gives into lazy selfishness, when he betrays the very people he's called to self-sacrificially lead and serve for fleeting self-indulgent pleasures, he becomes an agent of the enemy. And once man is compromised, the rest of the dominoes start to fall. These trends of societal chaos that we see nowadays all stem from the erosion of strong men. What we think about male leadership and Christ's lordship go hand in hand. Once you take God out of the picture, the enemy has his way with men. Secularism gives way to worshiping the self, reason, and science, eroding man's sense of duty, leading him to pursue hedonism and materialism. And with man weakened, women are tempted and allowed to usurp man. So then you get feminism, and from feminism you get sexual liberation, and from that, total all-consuming perversion of God's order. From the ancients to the moderns, in good times and hard times, this perversion was and always is the service and worship of Satan and his demons. History reveals this to be the case. In the ancient world, there was no idea of atheism. There were God's people and idol worshippers. God's people were called to be set apart, to reject the spectacle and debauchery of the pagans, and to submit to God's rules. But even they were prone to turn away to the idols. All demon worship begins with a rebellion against God, or at the very least, the natural law which he has written on our hearts. And who are the original rebels against God? Satan and his demons. They are the ones whose will is done by those who reject God. The rebellious man thinks he's serving his own will. Satanism and all its repackaged forms are sold under the pretense of do what thou wilt. But man never serves his own will. He either serves God's will or inadvertently serves the will of demons. That's what's so clever about it. The man without God thinks he's making his own way, but he's really just giving himself up to be puppeted. That's why leftists have this unending rebel complex. They think they're raging against the machine, but all the while every corporation and media outlet and most everyone in the government supports their cause. But they still feel rebellious because they are rebelling against nature and God while thinking that they're all edgy and clever and unique, despite walking into the same trap that has ensnared the godless for millennia. We see this all throughout history. In biblical times, these spirits which operated behind the pagan idols were referred to in the Old Testament Hebrew as shadim, but in the New Testament Greek, they're called daemons. There are many of these principalities with many names across history, but the three most prominent in scripture are Baal, the possessor, Ashtoreth, the transformer, and Moloch, the destroyer. All of these powers corrupt and twist and falsely imitate what God has made, and their servants make sacrifices at their idols, their conduits, for material gain. But the victory of Christ over death changed this. The world became majority Christian under the exhortation to go out unto all the earth proclaiming the gospel. Not just some of the earth, mind you, all of the earth, because whatever isn't reclaimed for Christ remains under demonic oppression. This is a battle for dominion. There is no middle ground or in between. And at least in the Western world, paganism and organized demon worship was eradicated. There were still problems, of course, because man is fallen and sinful, but our societies as a whole were built on Christian principle, and everyone was better off for it. At least they were better off for it until the rise of humanism. Though the Renaissance rediscovered a great many cultural beauties from the ancient world, it also sparked a rise in human-centered thinking and the development of modern science. Initially, the sciences were subservient and congruent with God. There was always an understanding that science could only explain certain things, whereas God's truth was higher. But slowly, this man-centered thinking started overtaking God-centered thinking. Science became the mechanism to explain everything. And because science is all knowledge which is immediately observable, everything started to exclude the transcendent, what can't be observed. Then man gets a little too big for his britches with all this explaining the observable that he decides that man doesn't need anything more than what his own eyes can devise. But thinking that our rationality here and now knows more than God's unchanging word is so foolish, like a pig with his head in a trough thinking he can comprehend the whole farm. Or as John Wesley put it, bring me a worm who can comprehend a man, and I'll show you a man who can comprehend the triune God. It seems foolish because it is, but at the dawn of the so-called Enlightenment, this idea was really picking up steam. The Enlightenment gave birth to liberalism and egalitarianism, systems which try to eliminate hierarchy and inequality. And if everything's on the same playing field, there's no reason to defer to God and the transcendent over man and the immanent. And if it's all equal, is there really anything innately right or wrong? Can't we just let the best decisions work out and prevail over the ones that don't? Turns out that that never works, because when you understand the heart of man to be flawed, you understand that we will never arrive at and uphold the best decisions on our own, because we would always rather take the easy route than the best one. And we see this difference in understanding manifest in the two revolutions which occurred right after the Enlightenment in America and France. I'm not going to pretend like everyone who participated in the American Revolution was a perfect Christian, but don't get me wrong, many of them were devout Christians, and the revolution itself was theistic. John Adams himself remarked that the Constitution was for a moral and religious people and wholly inadequate for any other. That religion and morality was overwhelmingly Christian. They were not perfect in their understanding and a little bit misguided with the prevailing Enlightenment ideas at the time to foresee how liberalism always erodes people's morals and religion, but they were not trying to eliminate God and his ways as guiding forces for their burgeoning civilization. On the contrary, God's wisdom was integral to their thought process. The French Revolution, on the other hand, fundamentally revolted against God. And look what that got him. Decades of turmoil, counter-revolution, and bloodshed, all permeated by enmity to the church and cultic worship of reason. Unlike the American Revolution, they were atheistic, or at least they thought they were, because they were actually following demons. Also, it's worth noting that the concept of left and right wing comes from the French National Assembly, where the Christians sat on the right side and the anti-Christians sat on the left. And we know all too well that this godless leftism didn't die with the French Revolution. It went on to affect other parts of Europe and America, leading to modernism, an effort to simplify everything down to its purest essence. Modernists want to remake the world without the good, the true, and the beautiful, without anything that points to something higher than man. And this is where we get the idea of progress and change for its own sake as a moral driver for shaping society. But change as a moral good is an inversion. God is ultimately good and completely unchanging. Man is flawed, and because he is flawed, he must change. That can either be a change towards God, towards order and stability, or it can be a change away from God, to chaos and disorder. Before industrialism, we had a tradition of advancement. Progress and prosperity weren't issues in and of themselves because they were guided and informed by a godly understanding of the world's brokenness and how God can use us to make the best of our situation for his glory. Sanitation, natural medicine and science, infrastructure, agriculture, and many other forms of progress and technology were used for the betterment of humanity because we understood the technology was in the service of others and it meant nothing without God. But the Industrial Revolution changed all of that. The reason for change and the rate at which that change occurred morphed progress into a destructive ideology. We prioritized monetary gain over societal good, with no godly authority or morality to curb sinful motives. And as for the rate of change, it became so rapid that consequences could not be observed or considered. Patience and self-sacrifice are no longer virtues, and instant hedonistic materialism were enshrined in their place. Our goals for creating are no longer in service of others, but for the sake of our own convenience. Convenience is literally considered by most people as a virtue, as one of the highest goods. Ask anyone to tell you why they like any given thing, and I guarantee you that part of the reason why they find value in something is because it's convenient, quick, efficient, simple, cheap, easy, etc., etc. And we're all guilty of this because it's so ingrained. That's not to say that utility has no place. Frugality and practicality are great qualities so long as they are not prioritized at the expense of more transcendent values like beauty. Before modernism, these qualities were understood as able to harmonize with each other. But in an industrial modernity, they were pitted against each other until the transcendent was discarded entirely. What post-industrial societies value most are things which lack value, because value is an impediment to convenience and pleasure. That's exactly why all our useless crap is made in China or Indonesia, because they don't have a Western standard of valuing life and stewarding nature, so they make things as quickly and cheaply as possible with no regard to ethics. But if you want to do it the humane and naturalistic way, it's going to take longer and cost more, but that's actually a good thing. Doing things with value and patience will always be more beneficial to society in the long run. What we've seen with this endless pursuit of convenience is the rapid decay of our social dynamics. All this progress, all this technology surrounds us with the fake and insulates us from the real. We are separated from the act of producing, separated from nature, and separated from God. Being made in the image of the Creator, man was made to make things. This can be concrete things like trades or labor jobs, but it can also be cerebral but still tangible things like writing or art or even statecraft, just to name a few. When we devote our lives to cultivating, to sowing and reaping, to putting in the time and work to produce something, anything according to our God-given talents, we are living out Adam's call to tend the garden, and in that we are most fulfilled as men. But this disconnection we experience through industrialism also disconnects us from the very act of making. We participate in activities which themselves do not contribute to stewardship and cultivation, but serve as surrogates for those things. And the more and more removed we become, the less we maintain responsibility and preserve meaning. We only value quantity over quality, utility over beauty, and trends over timelessness. And this hollowing out of work and purpose is contributing to the hollowing out of the family. In the pre-modern world, you didn't have to teach men and women to take on their proper roles. They had to in order to survive. It's like that one survival show where the women are all freaking out, but the guys have already started a fire and they're just living it up, guys being dudes. So all the women scurry over to the camp that has fire. That's just natural. But the more we become disconnected from nature, the more decadent and insulated we become. It's no wonder that we start behaving unnaturally. There's a reason that primates only masturbate in captivity. When you put a man in a cage, his mind becomes similarly debased. Men become detached from productivity and from family. In pre-modern times, men worked at home or very close to it, and the family was often involved with or at least present in the work. But now the modern man has no overlap with family and livelihood. Instead, he commutes far away to an office or factory and works long hours, minimizing time spent with family, maximizing his time isolated in little boxes. At home, most of the jobs that used to occupy women are done by appliances, but instead of using that extra time to better the home, they're encouraged to get out of the home just like the men so that the kids can be raised by the government in schools or by overbearing childless women at daycare centers. Sounds very healthy for the family unit. And there's hardly ever any extended family around to help out because we're totally atomized, generationally and individually. We're disconnected from each other, from our family, from the past and from the future, and we're told to live here and now, drowning it all in the noise of endless, mindless work and vapid pleasure to numb the deep dissatisfaction we feel, also that we can be a cog in a machine that is actively destroying everything good and beautiful about Western civilization. Men are being weaponized against themselves. And that's exactly what happened with the world wars, the first industrialized wars. They weren't over resources, but over globalist grudges that sent an entire generation of men to fight and kill and be killed by other young men who they probably had more in common with than the people telling them to go and fight each other. And look what's happened as a result. The atomization was cemented. Our history and our traditions were quite literally cut off and destroyed and replaced by meaningless modernist garbage. Women were shoved into the workforce because men were gone. And it's been that way ever since, even after they came back. Men are absent even if they're present, and women are doing the man's job either by necessity or in rebelliousness. And from the war, our industrial capacity and reliance skyrocketed, which helped fuel a redefined economy and globalist world hegemony. This was the restart button that the Enlightenment wanted. Industrialism brings secularism to fruition. It makes it a reality. Just as the ancients worshipped idols made with hands which channeled real demonic power, so do we channel that same power by worshiping our own mind and our own inventions. And since the world wars, godless Enlightenment values like liberal democracy, globalism, antinatalism, anti-patriarchy, anti-protectionism, and any other corrosive modern idea you can think of was firmly established in our society, all in the name of opposing destructive, dangerous nationalism, which is basically admitting openly that these policies and conditions are designed specifically so that no one would ever rebel against your world order. And how do you do that? Make men physically weak, mentally distracted, and spiritually lost. As far as the elite were concerned, this time they had finally extricated God from his place and given man supremacy and power. But that's never really what happens. They thought they had won a great victory for themselves, but they had really only won it for the demonic. The post-war era was fertile ground, not for the supremacy of man, but for the return of demon worship. Initially, there was a surge of conservative sentiment desiring to uphold traditional values, but the groundwork had already been laid for turmoil. Families may have looked more traditional, but our institutions had long since been compromised. But even still, the family itself was set up for failure in the post-war era because the stereotypical 50s home life was more of a caricature than a real reflection of tradition. The family was still atomized, consumeristic, and disconnected from past and extended family. And even though many great men helmed those families, their children were prime targets for the liberal evils that had taken firm root in our institutions. McCarthy tried to warn us. The communists were going to take over. We just couldn't listen. It would be the children of that final generation of strong men who would bring about the sexual revolution and contemporary feminism. But before we talk further about the social movements and the ideologies of the post-war era, we have to understand something first. Those Those ideologies and social movements were enabled by some of the consequences of rapid untested change brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Like I said, industrialism reinforces secularism, and in the same way that secularism deteriorates the spiritual, industrialism deteriorates the physical. Industrial food and medicine are especially detrimental to our well-being and our families. This phenomenon of weak men isn't merely ideological, it's biological. Just look at plastics, for example. Plastics were developed as a cheap alternative to natural materials during World War II, but come to find out all too late that they're highly toxic, they never break down, they have severe effects on hormonal health, and they're basically inescapable anywhere on planet Earth. Don't even get me started on the food we eat. Just look at what happens per generation to a family introduced to an industrialized diet. You can see the strength and vitality drain out of them. It even changes the facial bone structure and compresses the nasal cavity, which is exacerbated by allergies which come from genes, producing a generation of mouth breathers. Who would you rather rule over? Who do you think is less of a threat to your power? This is the way the system is designed cradle to grave. The average person is born in a hospital, which is already unideal for a number of reasons. Then they're given enough shots to give an elephant autism or epilepsy or allergies. Then they're fed formula, which is just soy powder with 2,000 times the estrogen as breast milk. They're dependent on the industrialized medical system from before they're even born. Then they're set up to be sick so they can depend on pharmaceuticals down the road. And once you move on to solid food, the overwhelming majority of it isn't actually food. It's literally filler made by agricultural byproducts that would be thrown away otherwise if some insidious pigs didn't decide that they could put it in food to make money and demonize real food. No one had seed oils or high fructose corn syrup or soy milk or Beyond Meat prior to industrialization. And it just so happens that they didn't have heart disease or cancer. Our entire healthcare system is actually designed to keep you chronically sick and dependent, slowly dying while they siphon every last penny from you. Most of our doctors aren't trained to help you to get better. They're only trained to tell you which expensive surgery to get or which prescription drug to take for the rest of your life. And because they're mostly incompetent, I say mostly because there are some great doctors out there, but the majority are just salesmen for big pharma. So they actually make fatal mistakes far more than people realize. Medical malpractice is the largest killer behind abortion, heart disease, and cancer. And even though there are medical journals who would tell you, no, those statistics are wrong. Doctors are heckin' wholesome and smart and don't kill thousands of people a year. You have to listen to them and trust them. I guarantee you that the actual numbers are even higher than what's accounted for because of indirect malpractice that leads to someone dying years down the line from chronic illness instead of ones who died quickly from direct malpractice. Our system has no interest in solving the root cause. It only masks and perpetuates problems because you can't make a lot of money or fearmonger off of people who are actually healthy. And even besides the money, our entire medical system is rooted in unnaturally trying to prolong life and cheat death by some means other than Christ. Man tries to play God, and what does he do but create man-made horrors beyond my comprehension? I think the worst case of this has got to be the oral contraceptive, which came about in 1960, which allowed people to have reckless sex out of wedlock and remove the consequence of possibly having a child. Well, they thought they removed all the consequences by not being able to have a baby, but what they didn't know is that it creates entirely unforeseen consequences, like making all the women who take it frozen in a state of ovulation, which makes you more cautious because you're anticipating having a baby, but being in that state perpetually means that you overproduce estrogen, so you're averse to anything perceived as unsafe or risky, and you can even become attracted to effeminate men or even women. Like, you can't have a baby now, but your endocrine system is almost irreparably dysfunctional. So you have a drug which allows you to play God that the majority of women are taking that comes with all these other side effects, which makes them biologically opposed to masculine men, but it's also produced in such high quantities that it's in the runoff water and ends up in the water we drink, and on top of that, the soy and seed oils and microplastics that are in the food we eat mimic estrogen in the endocrine system. So you have both men and women whose sex hormones are increasingly and disproportionately estrogenized, so it's no wonder that strong men are disappearing. That's not to say that it isn't men's fault because of these environmental factors, because man's hubris created those environmental factors. And most men in their apathy do nothing about it. They'd rather stick their head in the sand and watch sports ball or play video games. Now more than ever, it's easier and more socially and biologically conducive for men to abdicate all responsibility, to let women be subversive, and to leave children to be preyed upon. Couple that with the removal of religion, like how prayer was removed from schools in 1962, and you've set the stage for total collapse. And that's exactly what happened. In the late 60s and early 70s, sexually liberated feminism came about, enabled by contraceptives, giving women more impunity than ever to be agents of chaos. And as we've discussed, once you remove sex out of the confines of being between a married man and a married woman for the purpose of procreation and unity between the spouses, all bets are off and you're already on your way down the slippery slope into the total undefining of sex. Feminism and the sexual revolution profaned the sanctity of marriage, which in turn fed the rampant epidemic of children being born out of wedlock, deteriorating the family unit, as well as increasingly deviant perversions of sex like sodomy, until men and women are destroyed altogether in unsexed insanity, where men can be women if they watch enough pornography, or women can chop their breasts off and become men. And all of this is exacerbated by industrialized consumer culture. Social media and pornography incentivize sexual deviancy in the same way that the medical industry makes billions of dollars off of sexually deranged people who have been coerced into believing that they need to mutilate their bodies to be happy. And those people go on to be perpetual patients of that system who will be paying for drugs and surgeries and endless follow-up appointments for the rest of their life. This is the pinnacle of constructing a secular false world completely disconnected from reality and God's truth, which is all enabled by industrialism. But even that wasn't enough for man to take control over nature. Not even oral contraceptives could entirely stop the natural consequences of intercourse, so now we have an industrialized abortion industry which makes billions of dollars from ripping babies apart in their own mother's wombs and selling the parts off for a number of reasons, including in pharmaceuticals like vaccines or even chemical food additives. By increasing the rate of change beyond our control, industrialism creates consequences that we lack awareness of until it's far too late. And while we're worse off now, this sinful attempt to control and manipulate nature for our own gain isn't new. Magic was the ancient way of using demonic power to manipulate nature, and even though we're less aware of it now, modern pharmaceuticals are doing the same thing. Even the word for magic is pharmakia in the Greek. When we try to break out of the limitations of our own humanity, when we try to play God, chaos always follows. And not only do we get physical destruction, but also ideological destruction, leading us not to be triumphant rulers over nature, but slaves to evil powers who manipulate us by our own sinful nature. There's a reason that modernism and atheism aren't that popular anymore, because people know deep down that there is more than only the physical. But once you remove God, people start looking for transcendence elsewhere, and the enemy is right there waiting for them, masquerading as an angel of light. Instead of atheism, we now have neo-paganism and yoga and witchcraft. Instead of modernism, you have postmodernism, which is obsessed with non-objectivity, arbitrary complexity, and confusion. As far as our Western nations go, we don't have a separation of church and state, we have a state-created religion of idol worship. Don't worry guys, when we all gathered to make pretend sacrifices to Moloch, we were just goofing around. And when we had that witch come over to our house to do a blood ritual, that was just a performance art piece, okay? Stop being a crazy conspiracy theorist. Stop pretending like the statues we put up, and the holidays we enshrine, and the people we tell you to revere, and the rituals we mandate look anything like idols, or a church calendar, or saints, or sacraments. Stop paying attention. Stop paying attention. Stop paying attention. When you remove God from society, society crumbles. It sounds simple, because it is, but few people acknowledge this and fewer still offer real solutions. Weak men create hard times, but hard times create strong men, if those men embrace what it truly means to be strong, to rise to the occasion and be the leaders God has called us to be. When men are compromised, everything else is left vulnerable. Men are the leaders and ultimately responsible for societal trajectory. Post-industrial postmodernity has tried to make men ineffective leaders so that everyone else can be exploited. It has tried to make it impossible socially, legally, religiously, even biologically to be a real godly man. But it has not succeeded entirely. There is a remnant left. There is a contingent of men with the potential to be the strong men forged in the fire of hard times. But only if we rise to the occasion. Our civilization is hanging on by a thread. If we do nothing, the version of 2100 where everyone is a fat, gay, consumerist blob is an inevitability. If we do nothing, men as we know them will be eradicated for good, and we will be completely vulnerable to deep demonic control. And while it was men who were responsible for this, it is also men who can set things right. We can't do it on our own, but if we put our trust in God's strength and conform to His design for our lives in our civilization, we might just have a shot at changing the future. The future is not yet, and as bleak as things may seem, through God, all things are possible. We may yet see a return to patriarchal male leadership, the destruction of idols, the eradication of open sexual deviancy and hostility towards normal people, and a return to acknowledging Christ's lordship, under whom wise and strong men steward the earth and their families. But even if this doesn't happen, everything will burn and Christ will return in judgment, so either way, we win. And though the future is lost if we do nothing, I know that won't be the case because God always raises up a remnant to enact His will in the direst of times. There will be men and women, even if we are few, who will stand and fight for truth. God's side is a fighting side. There's no room for partiality any longer. It's time to embrace that fight. And as important as it is to establish everything we've talked about thus far, identifying the problem is only useful if we can identify a solution. If you want to fight, if you want to see our civilization return to its Christian roots, here's what you should and shouldn't do. The first step is to forsake apathy. In a world banking on your ineffectiveness to achieve your full potential, indifference is a death sentence. You can't just pretend that these things aren't happening or that they somehow won't affect you in the long run. Even if they didn't, you should still desire to look out for the well-being of your neighbor despite what affects you or what doesn't affect you. As nice as it may sound to disappear into the woods and leave secular, industrialized, matriarchal society behind, that only makes problems worse with your absence, and they will eventually reach you no matter how far you run. Do not let yourself become passive. Even though we shouldn't withdraw our presence from society, it's vital that we withdraw from the factors influencing us to become passive. Reduce your media consumption to as low as is necessary to stay informed. Participating in the culture is good and necessary, but you must do so with heavy scrutiny towards the messages you're being fed through our culture. Prioritize that which is edifying and thought-provoking. Minimize that which is deceptive and subversive, even if it seems enjoyable or hard to let go of. It's a waste of time, it's rotting your brain, and I promise you that you won't miss it that much in the long run. It's worth it. Speaking of intake, the physical and spiritual food you feed on have profound ramifications for your effectiveness. Seek what is godly, natural, and time-tested. If we want to know how to fix the contemporary world, we must become acquainted with how people thought and acted prior to the contemporary world. I think the biggest mindset shift in that regard is rejecting the gynocratic feminine sensibilities that govern our society. We have to reclaim a godly understanding of men and women. Certain natural female sensibilities have their place, but that place is not the battlefield. Men, become masculine exclusively. Purge effeminacy from your life so that women may have the freedom to be feminine exclusively, and purge all mannishness from their lives. As we discussed earlier, while the physical matters, manliness and womanliness come down to taking on proper roles of leader and helper and all that those roles entail. We have to reject a consumerized idea of masculinity and femininity and redefine them by a pre-modern godly standard. Really, we should redefine everything by that standard because, after all, we should seek first the kingdom of heaven. Be guided by God and don't stray from His designs, and He will make our paths straight and our plans clear. Don't prioritize the temporal over the eternal. Self-gratification, entertainment, wealth, even culture and politics are all vain pursuits if they are not informed by an adherence to God's precepts. God is light, and without Him we will continue in the darkness that has enveloped our lives. But we must be intentional in seeking that light out and denying the enemy the strongholds he has in our lives. Fleeing sexual immorality is chief among the ways by which we can do this. Read God's word and meditate on it, and pray daily. Find a good church and fellowship with other believers that will help keep you accountable, and put on the full armor of God. We are at war, and it's time we acted like it. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind and stop caring what other people think about you. In a world so extremely abnormal, normality will always seem like extremism. But it's not your job to peddle what feels safe and nice. Your job is to defend the truth and proclaim it in love. It's going to be uncomfortable the same way that exercising a long unused muscle will be, but it's now or never. The time for excuses is over. It's time to commit because your future and the future of your children and their children is on the line. Become the American you wish this country was made up of. Civilizational change starts with individual change. Hone your body, which is the temple of the Lord. Work out, eat right, learn to protect yourself and your family, overcome vice, especially the gluttony and sloth which go entirely unaddressed in our society, even in the modern church. Sharpen your mind by reading old books and cultivating a hunger for knowledge. Get connected with the past, not only through books, but also by family members and friends from prior generations. Seek wise counsel from elders and mentors in your life. Build your family. Get married and have lots of kids. As much as we would like to convert people to our side, the more surefire way to boost our numbers is to have and raise godly children. Don't rush into it, but don't hesitate either. Now is certainly not the time to waste your youth away. And if you're not quite ready for it, commit this time to letting God prepare you to be the best spouse and parent you can be before those responsibilities come about. And again, get involved in church, read and study God's word daily, and trust in the Lord with all your heart. Fight like everything depends on it, because it does. Reject degeneracy, destroy idolatry, and become ungovernable by the agents of the enemy, because you are so wholeheartedly governed by Christ the King. Commit to doing right by Him, not by the world, in boldness. Speak the truth, live the truth, and do it all in love, not niceness, but genuine desire for the good of others in spite of what our broken world is telling them to seek otherwise. And when we do that, when we love the Lord God with all our heart, mind, and strength, and when we love our neighbors as ourselves, when we become unified as one nation under God, then, and only then, will we begin to make things right. There is a future out there for the civilization where men are truly men, women are truly women, and Christ is acknowledged as King. It's out there, if only we have the courage to fight for it.